long before the pyramids rose from the sands. A forgotten empire shaped the very blueprint of civilization, only to vanish from the pages of history. What if everything we thought began with Egypt actually began somewhere else? The wind howls across a barren stretch of desert where the Nile once overflowed into green. Beneath the sand, time has hidden something strange. It is not a pyramid, not a tomb, and not a temple. It is older, much older, older than Egypt, older than the Sumerians. It predates the pharaohs and their gods. And yet it ruled. A kingdom, an empire, call it what you will, but it thrived in a time so distant, even memory forgot its name. It begins in silence. No hieroglyphs carved into stone walls, no clay tablets left behind. What remains are fragments, pottery, bone, charred ash, and circular stone arrangements that seem to whisper to the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond the boundaries of history books, was an empire that may have lit the first spark of civilization, and it did not rise in Mesopotamia. It rose further south, along the Nile, in lands we now call Nubia and the Eastern Sahara. Long before the names Khufu, Narmer, or Sargon echoed through the Nile or the Euphrates, people were organizing, herding, building, and worshipping in ways no one expected. Their cattle were buried in ceremonial graves. Their stones were aligned with the solstices. Their settlements stretched along dried lake beds where hippos once swam. These were not wandering tribes. They were a people with vision, stability, and power. They were shaping a world that Egypt would later claim as its own. What history remembers as the first great civilizations, Egypt and Sumer, may have actually inherited more than they invented. But the evidence is scattered. You do not see this forgotten empire in textbooks. Museums rarely mention it. Even archaeologists, until recently, overlooked it. But then, something strange started to emerge from the dunes. A stone circle at Nabta Playa, far south of Cairo, older than Stonehenge, aligned with stars, used for marking time and seasons. Who built it? And why did it vanish? The story deepens with every discovery. In a tomb at Kustul, a carved incense burner reveals a procession. A figure sits on a throne, wearing a crown, one that looks exactly like the white crown of Upper Egypt. There are no hieroglyphs naming this king. But this image predates Egypt's first dynasty. Could it be that kingship itself came from further south? Could Egypt's pharaohs have borrowed the very concept of divine rule from a civilization they later tried to erase? Some scholars believe so. They speak of Tarseti, land of the bow, mentioned in the earliest Egyptian records, not as a mythical place, but as a real kingdom, a powerful one, possibly the first kingdom. Some believe Tarseti might have stretched across what is now southern Egypt and northern Sudan. If true, it would make this forgotten empire not only older than Egypt, but its blueprint. But there is more. The people of this land did not just vanish. They moved. They adapted. As the Sahara dried up, their settlements drifted toward the Nile. What we now call Upper Egypt may have been settled not by isolated locals, but by migrants from an older civilization driven out of the lush savannas that once covered the desert. Their gods, their customs, their symbols, many may have flowed northward, carried on cattle trails and along riverbanks. And yet, we forgot them, not because they were unimportant, but because history is often told by those who build in stone and conquer with armies. Egypt built, Egypt endured, and Egypt, in time, claimed even the past as its own. The names of the early Nubian kings were not carved into granite walls. Their cities were not immortalized in myth, and so, for thousands of years, their memories slipped beneath the sands. But archaeology remembers what history forgets. Carbon dating does not lie. when the remnants of ancient settlements, astronomical structures, and royal tombs are analysed, they speak with a different voice, a voice that challenges the old timelines, a voice that suggests human complexity was thriving long before the first pyramid rose. This forgotten empire did not leave us written legends, but it left us bones, stones, and burned offerings. It left cattle buried with reverence, aligned to solstices. It left pottery styles later mirrored in Egypt. It left echoes in royal iconography and statecraft. And maybe most hauntingly, it left behind the shape of memory itself, a memory Egypt may have claimed but never invented. Before the pharaohs carved gods into rock, before Sumer measured the heavens, before Uruk and Memphis and Thebes, there was someone else, a people, an order, a power. And now, thousands of years later, that power is starting to whisper again. We were here, it says, long before you ever thought to look. The first shovelful of sand is rarely dramatic. There's no sudden glint of gold, no buried crown waiting to be found. But somewhere in the heat-shimmering silence of Sudan, of southern Egypt, of the eastern Sahara, men and women in sweat-stained shirts kneel with brushes and sieves, coaxing stories from dust. They are chasing shadows, not of pharaohs, not of temples, but of the people who came before, long before. They are digging for the pre-Egyptians. It sounds impossible. How can one search for a civilization that left no written name for itself? No scrolls, no annals, no lists of kings. Just heat-blasted pottery fragments, bone tools polished smooth with use, and patterns of settlement half buried in dried-out basins that once cradled lakes. But archaeology is not about what is obvious. It is about what is missing. And the deeper these teams dig, the more they realize there was someone here before Egypt, someone organized, someone creative, someone powerful. The first hints came not from monuments, but from patterns. In the southern reaches of modern Egypt and the northern deserts of Sudan, researchers found strange burial sites. At places like Kustul, Sayala, and Toshka, graves revealed not only human remains, but arranged offerings, cattle skulls, ivory carvings, painted ceramics. Some tombs even held incense burners and decorated stone pallets. These were not the casual burials of nomads. They were ritualistic, purposeful, royal, perhaps, but from a time before kings were supposed to exist. At first, the assumption was simple. These must be early Egyptians, but the dates did not match. Radiocarbon testing pushed them back further than Egypt's first dynasty, and their designs, their crowns, thrones, and processions looked eerily similar to pharaonic iconography. But they came first. This was not Egypt. It was something else. Deeper into Sudan, the mystery intensified. At a place called Nabta Playa, archaeologists uncovered an ancient ceremonial site that defied expectations. There, in the middle of a now dead lake bed, stood a circle of stones, aligned precisely to the stars. Some of the stones formed rows that marked the summer solstice sunrise. Others pointed to the bright star Sirius. The site had been used, abandoned, and rebuilt multiple times over centuries, showing a memory passed through generations. And here's the part that shook everything. The oldest phase of Nabta Playa dates back to around 6,000 years before the present. That's older than the pyramids, older than the ziggurats of Ur, older than Stonehenge. Whoever built it understood time, seasons, and celestial movement. They had herds, they had ceremonies, and they had foresight, a prehistoric calendar buried under desert wind. Across the eastern Sahara, once green plains, now choked with sand, hold more secrets. In rock shelters and cliff walls, Prehistoric art shows images of boats, animals, dancers, and warriors. Some of the boats have curved prows, with figures aboard that appear crowned or elevated. These motifs later reappear in Egyptian art, but here, they predate it. One of the most provocative finds came from Qustul. In 1978, a team led by archaeologist Bruce Williams excavated a royal tomb containing a carved incense burner. The object showed a seated figure wearing what looked like the white crown of Upper Egypt, surrounded by attendants and royal symbols. This carving was dated to several centuries before the unification of Egypt. If the dating holds, and most scholars agree it does, it suggests that the idea of kingship, of processions, of divine rulers may have originated further south. But who were these people? That question haunts every expedition. They were not one tribe. They were likely many, connected across trade routes and seasonal migrations. Some lived in semi-permanent villages, tending cattle and gathering wild grains. Others followed the rains and lakes, building temporary shrines along their way. Their technology was simple but effective stone tools, bone awls, and eventually copper. Their art was expressive, their rituals elaborate, and their memory nearly erased. As Egypt rose to prominence, it rewrote the past. It called its southern neighbours the land of the bow, often portraying them as wild desert nomads. But that wasn't always true. In Egypt's oldest texts, Tarseti is described not as a backwater, but as a kingdom, a land of gold and archers, a land to be respected and feared. Some scholars now believe Tarseti was the name of that first forgotten kingdom, a state that may have existed for centuries before Egypt claimed its first pharaoh. Today, archaeologists face a brutal challenge. The Nile floods have changed course. The Sahara has swallowed entire settlements. Modern development threatens fragile sites, and political instability often halts fieldwork. But still they press on methodically, patiently mapping out ancient cemeteries with drones, analysing DNA from buried teeth, scanning the subsoil with ground-penetrating radar. In the hands of these modern detectives, every grain of sand becomes a clue, every broken shard a sentence in a forgotten story. And the deeper they dig, the more undeniable it becomes. Civilization did not begin suddenly, like a spark from a flint. It was a slow flame, and before Egypt stood in the sunlight, someone else lit the torch. They may never have written their name, but the land remembers. And now, so do we. Long before the Nile birthed the great cities of Memphis or Thebes, long before the names of Nama or Djoser echoed in temple halls, there was a place so ancient its memory survives only in stone and silence. A desolate stretch of desert in what is now southern Egypt, close to the border with Sudan. Today it is called Nabta Playa, but thousands of years ago it was something else entirely. Not just a settlement, not just a gathering place, but a cradle of belief, of order, and possibly of kings. Back then, the Sahara was not the endless sea of sand we know today. It was green, pulsing with life, dotted with seasonal lakes, herds of wild cattle, and people who understood the rhythm of the world in a way that feels almost impossible now. Nabta Playa sat beside one of these ancient lakes, a playa that would fill with water during the monsoon seasons and dry to cracked earth in the long droughts that followed. People came here not just to survive, but to observe, to mark time, to shape their universe with meaning. Archaeologists began serious excavation of Nabta Playa in the late 1970s and early 1980s. What they uncovered shook the foundations of what we thought we knew about early civilization. Buried beneath layers of sediment and sand was a stone circle, primitive in appearance, but precise in design. Upright slabs, some small enough to lift by hand, others weighing hundreds of pounds, arranged in patterns that pointed not randomly, but purposefully toward the summer, solstice sunrise, and toward the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. This was no accident. The people of Nabta Playa were watching the heavens, and they were doing it thousands of years before the construction of Stonehenge, before the first ziggurat rose in Mesopotamia, before Egyptian hieroglyphs ever etched the concept of time into papyrus. The stone circle at Nabta Playa dates back to roughly 6,000 years before the present. That's older than any known monumental astronomical site. And it was not a one-time event. It evolved. The people returned, rebuilt, and refined the alignment over centuries, suggesting a shared memory, a continuity, a purpose passed from parent to child, elder to apprentice. But astronomy was only part of the story. As researchers dug deeper into the area surrounding the circle, they found something stranger still. Rows of circular stone structures, some with burial chambers beneath them. In those chambers, they found the remains of cattle, not butchered, not discarded, but buried, carefully, deliberately, with signs of ritual. The implications were staggering. These were not just animals. They were sacred, possibly divine. Long before the golden bulls of Egypt's temples, before Apis, or Hathor, or Mnevis, the people of Nabta Playa may have worshipped cattle as holy beings. Some scholars now argue that the veneration of cattle began here not in the Nile Delta, not in the Levant, but deep in the prehistoric Sahara. And here's where it gets even more compelling. The cattle cult was not just a religion. It may have been the foundation of something greater social hierarchy, kingship, early forms of political order. Cattle, in that environment, were wealth. They were sustenance, mobility, and prestige. To own many meant power. To bury one, especially ceremonially, meant you had so much that you could sacrifice it to the gods. That act alone implied status, leadership, perhaps even divine favour. In the dust of Nabta Playa, we may be looking at the earliest seeds of royalty. If this theory holds, and more archaeologists believe it does, then Nabta Playa is not just an ancient observatory. It is the birthplace of kings. The way those ancient people moved across the land also mattered. They were not isolated. The Sahara was once a network of micro-regions, lake basins, and grasslands, linked by trade, migration, and memory. From Nabta Playa, travellers could reach the Nile Valley to the east, or descend south toward what would become Nubia and Kush. That movement likely spread their cosmology, their rituals, their social structures. Some scholars now believe that when the Sahara began to dry around 4,000 years before the present, these same people migrated into Upper Egypt. They brought with them their cattle cult, their solar alignments, their reverence for order and timing, and they found new rivers, new soil, new skies. But the beliefs they carried were already old. Think about that. By the time Egypt's first dynasty emerged around 3,100 years before the birth of Christ, Nabta Playa had already fallen silent. The stones had been standing for centuries, even millennia. The cattle had long since turned to bone. And yet, echoes of their ways lived on in the crowns of early kings, in the cattle, iconography carved into temple walls, in the obsession with aligning tombs and pyramids to stars and solstices. Even the Egyptian calendar may owe something to Nabta Playa. The star Sirius, which rises in early summer, played a central role in both. For the Egyptians, Sirius marked the flooding of the Nile. For the people of Nabta Playa, it signalled the return of rains. Both civilizations looked to the sky, not for stories, but for survival, for order in chaos. And so, In the heart of the desert, time itself was measured. Today, Nabta Playa sits mostly abandoned. There are no great ruins, no colonnades, no carved faces of forgotten gods. Just flat stones, some toppled, some buried, many still upright, defiant against the passage of centuries. Most tourists pass it by, unaware they are driving near the foundation of civilization. But for those who study it, Nabta Playa represents something rare, a moment in time when humans first began to look beyond the horizon and wonder, a time when observation became ritual and ritual became power, a time when kings may have first been imagined not as conquerors, but as keepers of the seasons. And so, while the world remembers Stonehenge, Babylon, or Memphis, the circle at Nabta Playa whispers a deeper truth. Civilization did not begin in marble halls. It began in a desert by a lake that no longer exists, where cattle were buried like gods, and stones pointed to the stars. In the beginning, before temples rose from limestone and the gods of Egypt took their familiar forms, the people of the Eastern Sahara bowed to something more immediate. Not sky gods or sun discs, not falcons or crocodiles. They worshipped what walked among them, what fed their families, what gave them milk, blood, hide, and warmth. They worshipped the cow, or more precisely, the spirit within it. To modern eyes, this may seem strange, but for the people who lived even 7,000 years ago in what was once a green Sahara, cattle were more than animals. They were sacred, symbols of fertility, strength, and divine balance. And in their bones, buried beneath ancient stones, those beliefs have endured. This was not farming in the way we think of it now. These were pastoralists, herders who moved with the seasons, chasing rain, grass, and survival. Their cattle were their currency, their companions, and their legacy. In their world, a man's worth could be measured in hooves, but not just in number, also in ritual. At sites like Nabta Playa, Bir Kiseba, and Wadi Hawa, archaeologists have found the remains of cattle deliberately buried in circular tombs, not butchered for meat, not discarded as waste, but placed carefully, sometimes alongside stones or small offerings, and then covered. These burials weren't random, they followed patterns. The animals were often aligned, sometimes alone, sometimes grouped. In a few cases, the burial chambers show signs of repeated visits or reopening, suggesting ritual use over time. This was no ordinary livestock management. This was reverence. In one of the most striking discoveries at Nabta Playa, the remains of a cow were buried inside a chambered tumulus, with stones arranged in a manner that suggests both architectural intention and symbolic geometry. There was no attempt to strip the carcass for food. This animal had been placed with care, as if it were being offered back to the earth or to the heavens. The logic behind these rituals lies in the worldview of those who performed them. Cattle, in these ancient cultures, were not just useful, they were sacred vessels. They represented nourishment, yes, but also cosmic rhythm, life and death, fertility and rebirth. The cow was a mother, a protector, a spirit guide. And this spiritual framework did not disappear when the desert dried. As climate change pushed these communities toward the Nile Valley, they brought their beliefs with them. Their sacred cattle would later find echoes in the gods of Egypt. Hathor, the goddess of love, fertility, and motherhood, was often depicted as a cow or as a woman with cow horns. Her temples echoed with the lowing of sacred bulls, and her imagery adorned some of the earliest shrines in Upper Egypt. She was mother to kings, protector of the pharaoh, and guardian of the dead. But Hathor was not the only one. The Apis bull, worshipped in Memphis, was believed to embody Ptah himself. It lived in luxury, adorned with jewelry and gold, and was buried in massive sarcophagi when it died. The Mevis bull, sacred to the sun god Ra, received similar honours. These divine bulls were not metaphors. They were believed to be literal incarnations of the god's living flesh through which the divine moved. And where did that idea come from? It likely began in the Green Sahara, in those early herding communities where a cow's gentle eyes reflected the stars, where its breath in the cold morning air was seen as spirit, and where its blood offered or spilled marked the turning of seasons. Even the act of cattle sacrifice, so prominent in later rituals, may have evolved from these ancient burial practices. In early African religious traditions, both in the Nile Valley and further south, the offering of cattle was a gateway act. It opened communication between the living and the ancestors, between mortals and spirits, and it was not done casually. A cow could not simply be killed. It had to be accepted by the spirits, chosen, prepared, honoured. In many traditional African cosmologies, the cow represents continuity, a bridge between the material and spiritual world, the idea that life flows through the herd, that ancestors return through cattle, that blessings are tied to their health. These are not new concepts. They echo back to those early days when the Sahara was alive and cattle were everything. What's remarkable is how deeply this reverence rooted itself in Egyptian identity. Even as Egypt grew into a civilization of stone, bureaucracy, and empire, the old symbols remained. Temple walls still bore images of cows licking newborn pharaohs. Burial chambers still carried offerings of milk and beef, and the pharaohs themselves wore crowns that traced back, not just to divine mandate, but to pastoral inheritance. The Nile gave Egypt its power, but the cow gave Egypt its soul, and that soul came from the desert, not the desert as we see it now, lifeless, endless, brutal, but from a time when the Sahara was fertile, when lakes dotted its valleys, and when early humans danced beneath the stars to honour the animal that sustained them. They were not nameless. They were not primitive. They were ancestors, and the gods of Egypt, in all their golden majesty, still carry traces of their footsteps. You can find them in the curve of Hathor's horns, in the silent gaze of Apis, in the buried bones of cattle left untouched in desert tombs older than pyramids. The Eastern Sahara, long before the pharaohs rose, was already holy ground, and in that holy ground, among herders and firelight and the rustle of grass, the first gods took shape, not in heaven, but in herds. There was a time when the Sahara was not a desert, not an endless sea of sand and silence, but a vast, living world of green. Rivers braided across grasslands, lakes shimmered under cloud-streaked skies, herds of antelope and gazelle grazed across open plains. Crocodiles slid through fresh water, and humans early, wandering, observant humans found in this land not desolation, but home. It is almost impossible to imagine now. Today, the Sahara stretches across the top of Africa like a great scar, a blistering ocean of heat and stone. But rewind the clock 10,000, even 12,000 years, and everything changes. What we now call the Holocene wet phase, or the African humid period, brought rainfall to regions that have been dry for thousands of years since. Monsoons swept up from the south. The sky opened, and the desert bloomed. This was the Sahara the first pastoralists knew, a place teeming with life. Not just scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, but organised communities. People who stayed, built, moved with the seasons, and returned again. Archaeological finds scattered across modern-day Chad, Libya, Sudan, and Egypt show a world of villages, shrines, and even early cemeteries. Some of these sites, like Gobero in Niger or Ouan Muhugiag in Libya, revealed deep social structures, burials with grave goods, children buried with mothers, pottery painted with fish and cattle. The people here were not nomads in the usual sense. They were seasonally mobile, yes, but rooted in patterns that made sense. They followed rains and rivers. They knew where the lakes would form and when they would vanish. They moved with rhythm, not randomly, but with memory. These were the first great migrations of settled humanity across the African continent. And they did not drift blindly. They watched the skies. They read the winds. And they built their lives into the landscape. They fished. They hunted. They painted. In caves and rock shelters across the Central Sahara, their art still remains. Etched into sandstone and drawn in ochre and charcoal are images of giraffes, elephants, crocodiles, and long-horned cattle. There are dancers and shamans, mothers and children, warriors and swimmers. Some of the most famous images, like those in the Cave of the Swimmers in Wadi Sura or the paintings at Tassili Naja, show people floating in water, arms stretched, legs bent as if weightless. This was no fantasy. They were painting the truth of their world, a world with lakes and floods, with abundance and warmth. These paintings are more than art. They are testimony. They tell us that before Egypt, before cities or kings, there was already civilization, not in the form of writing or monuments, but in memory, community, and belief. These were people who buried their dead with care, who returned to the same places year after year, who told stories in pictures, who saw animals not just as food, but as spirits, who stood beneath starlit skies and understood their place in a world that was both vast and personal. And then the rain stopped, not all at once. The end of the Green Sahara came slowly, in pulses. The monsoons weakened, the lakes dried, the rivers became seasonal streams, the grass turned to dust. Over hundreds, even thousands of years, the climate shifted. What was once lush became fragile. What was once predictable became harsh. And the people those early artists, herders, and settlers had to choose, stay and struggle, or move and adapt. Most moved. They followed the water. And that water was flowing more and more toward the Nile. The drying of the Sahara was not just an environmental event, it was a migration engine. It pushed entire populations toward the river valleys and oases that still held life. And this migration did not happen in silence. These were not refugees. They were carriers of memory, of tradition, of culture, honed over thousands of years in the green lands of the Sahara. They did not abandon their past. They brought it with them. And when they reached the Nile Valley, they found new rhythms, but they also reshaped the land with old knowledge. The early settlements that appeared in Upper Egypt, in places like Hierakonpolis and Nakada, show sudden bursts of complexity, burial practices, symbolic art, early hierarchies. Scholars now believe that many of these innovations may have come not from local invention, but from the memory of a greener world, a world where cattle were sacred, where rivers were watched for omens, where art told stories older than kings. In this way, the Nile civilization did not rise from nothing. It was seeded by the Sahara. Even the gods of Egypt carry echoes of this lost world. The divine cow, the crocodile deity, the connection between rebirth and the flooding river. These were ideas born not in palaces, but in the savannas, in the temporary villages beside once great lakes, in the songs sung by firelight and the footsteps across damp soil. The Green Sahara is not just a forgotten chapter, it is a foundation. And now, we are starting to remember. Through satellite imagery, we can see the ghost rivers that once carved the land. Through excavations, we are uncovering villages lost to time, Through ancient bones, we are tracing migrations that would reshape human history. And through rock art, we are hearing voices that refuse to be silenced. Before the desert, there was paradise. Not paradise in the mythical sense, but in the real, human way. A place where life could thrive, where people could gather, where memory could root itself deep into the soil. The Sahara was once such a place, and those who lived there, thousands of years before the pyramids left behind, not just stones and bones, but the echo of something far more enduring. They left behind the first whispers of civilization, before Narmer united Upper and Lower Egypt, before pyramids scraped the sky, and before hieroglyphs etched the names of kings into eternity. There was Tar Seti. The name means land of the bow, a reference to the famed archers of this ancient land. But this was no mere hunting ground. Tar Seti may have been the very first kingdom to rise along the Nile. Not Egypt, not Sumer, Tar Seti, a kingdom born in the shadows of time, in what we now call Nubia, far to the south, where the Nile flows fast and narrow through rocky gorges and ancient cliffs. The date was somewhere around 3,500 years before the birth of Christ. In the modern calendar, that puts us centuries before Egypt's first dynasty, centuries before Menes, or Narmer, before the unification of the two lands. And yet the archaeological evidence suggests that Tar Seti had kings. It had symbols of authority. It had organized trade, skilled artisans, and powerful rulers. And most importantly, it had memory. The region that gave birth to Tar Seti sits near the first cataract of the Nile, in what is now southern Egypt and northern Sudan. This land was a corridor where cultures flowed like the river itself. From deeper Africa came goods, people, and ideas. From the Mediterranean and Levant came tools, ornaments, and new crops. Tar Seti was at the crossroads. And the people there were not passive receivers. They were builders, organizers, innovators. What made Tar Seti a kingdom and not just a settlement was not just its artifacts, but its structure. At sites like Kustul, archaeologists uncovered royal tombs unlike anything previously seen in the region. These tombs included elaborate burial goods, fine ceramics, incense burners, and carved imagery that would look strikingly familiar to students of Egyptian art. On one such artifact, a stone incense burner from a royal tomb, there is an image of a seated figure wearing what appears to be the white crown of Upper Egypt. Before Egypt had pharaohs, Tar Seti had kings. This discovery was made in the late 1970s by Bruce Williams and his team at the Oriental Institute, and it ignited a controversy that still echoes today. If Tar Seti had royal imagery earlier than Egypt, if its art and symbols predate Egypt's first dynasty, then what does that mean for the origins of Egyptian civilization? Was Egypt born from within, or did it inherit a legacy from the south? Some scholars resisted the idea. Egypt, in their view, stood alone, an independent flowering along the Nile. But the evidence grew harder to ignore. The iconography from Kustul and other Nubian sites did not imitate Egypt. They came first. The processions, the thrones, the ceremonial boats, these were not copies. They were precursors. And it was not just symbols. It was structure. Tar Seti controlled trade routes that reached deep into Africa. Gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animals flowed northward. This wealth helped build its power, but wealth alone does not make a kingdom. It was the ability to organize, to control resources, to enforce authority across regions that made Tar Seti a state, a kingdom of memory and law, not just of muscle. Its people were likely a mix of cultures, descendants of the Green Sahara pastoralists, merged with Nile Valley fishers, and influenced by trade with Central Africa. Their language, now lost to time, may have been a precursor to later Nubian dialects. Their religion, though poorly understood, surely centered on the same natural forces that shaped all life along the Nile Sun: flood, cattle, and kingship. Kingship, that is the heart of the mystery. For in Tarseti, we see the early model of what would later become the divine pharaoh of Egypt. The king was more than a ruler. He was the axis between heaven and earth. His burial was not just an end, but a transformation. And this belief, so central to Egyptian identity, may have been born first in the southern reaches of the Nile. When Egypt's early rulers rose, they adopted many forms that had already taken shape in Tarseti: the white crown, the concept of the royal procession, the use of incense and sacred boats. Even the idea of portraying kings as larger than life may trace its roots to the visual traditions of this southern kingdom. But what happened to Tarseti? Like many early states, it did not vanish suddenly. It faded. As Egypt rose and unified under the First Dynasty, the influence of Tarseti was absorbed. Its leaders were either conquered, intermarried, or co-opted into the growing Egyptian state. But memory is stubborn. Egypt would always remember its southern kin, not always fondly, but always with awe. For centuries, Egypt would refer to its southern neighbours as warriors, archers, and mystics, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies. But beneath the shifting politics, a truth remained. The south came first, and even in its decline, the legacy of Tarseti endured. The worship of certain gods in Upper Egypt retained Nubian traits. The value placed on gold and cattle, both abundant in Tarseti, remained central to Egyptian wealth. And every time a pharaoh donned the white crown, he wore a symbol first carved by kings who ruled before the pharaohs had names. Today, much of Tarseti lies beneath the waters of Lake Nasser, drowned by modern dams and lost to direct excavation. But the memory survives in carved stone, in burial chambers, and in the shape of a crown. Tarseti was not a footnote. It was a beginning, and for those who study the deep roots of civilization, it stands as a quiet, powerful reminder that before Egypt stood alone as a symbol of ancient majesty, another kingdom watched the Nile. A kingdom that knew power, that knew kings, that knew how to rule. The land of the bow was the first to draw the line between chaos and order, the first to crown a ruler, the first to whisper to the river and be answered. And though the sands have claimed its name, the river has not forgotten. Long before the name Kush echoed through Egyptian temples, and long before the black pharaohs of Napata marched north to rule the Nile, there was something older, something half buried in red dust and scattered shards, a cultural prototype, a blueprint, and it began in the southern lands of Nubia in the twilight hours of the Neolithic, when cattle cults still ruled the high desert and kings were still learning how to walk like gods. This ancient formation, often called the Kushite prototype, was not a kingdom in the way we understand later empires. It had no known capital city, no long list of named rulers, no surviving monuments of colossal stone, and yet, in its fragments, it holds the DNA of future greatness. It planted the seeds from which Kerma, Napata, and Meroe would later bloom. The clues are scattered, a painted bowl here, a buried hut there, but when assembled, they speak with quiet conviction. What they say is this: the Nubians were not merely Egypt's shadow, they were builders of their own legacy. Start with the pottery. It is some of the oldest and finest on the continent, long before the pharaohs were commissioning alabaster jars. Nubian potters were firing clay into vessels so smooth, so symmetrical, that they still astonish archaeologists today. Their craftsmanship speaks of a people who understood form and function, who made containers not just to hold, but to speak. The classic Nubian ware, black-topped red pottery, dates back to the 5th millennium before Christ. The rims are often burnished to a near metallic sheen, as if the hands that made them knew they were crafting more than household tools. Some pieces were etched with geometric designs, others painted with simple symbols, swirls, dots, waves. These were not random decorations. They were language, an unspoken script of tradition, passed from hand to hand through generations. This same attention to form would later shape the architecture of Kerma, the first great Nubian capital. And Kerma itself did not rise from nowhere. It rose from precedent from the settlements and design principles of the Kushite prototype. Circular huts clustered into compounds, storage pits dug deep to preserve grain, defensive perimeters built not from panic, but from planning. These were the blueprints of a society moving toward urbanism. But architecture tells only part of the story. The deeper current, the one that would carry Nubia into greatness, was kingship. At Kustal, in what is now the northern fringe of Nubia, royal tombs from the 4th millennium before Christ offer tantalizing evidence. We spoke of the incense burner with the white crown, but that was only one piece. Other tombs from the same cemetery contained goods suggestive of elite status: ivory combs, gold beads, ceremonial palettes. These graves were not ordinary. They were curated, symbolic, fit for rulers. Even if we do not know the names of these kings, we know they existed. And more importantly, we know they were remembered. It is from this remembered kingship that later Nubian dynasties drew power. Kerma would take the idea and build it into an institution. Napata would wrap it in myth and divine mandate. And Meroe would fuse it with iron and empire. But the root was here, in the ancestral model of sacred authority, ritual burial, and cultural identity. And identity mattered. For much of early African history, Egypt has dominated the spotlight. Its pyramids, its hieroglyphs, its god-kings in golden masks. But Nubia had its own light, and it was never merely a reflection. The Kushite prototype reveals that long before Egyptian influence swept south, Nubia was already forging a distinct cultural path, one rooted in cattle, river, fire, and time. This distinctiveness is clearest in the spiritual echoes that linger across Nubian sites. Rock art from the region depicts rituals that may predate Egyptian funerary practices, figures with outstretched arms, animals arranged in procession, symbols etched into cliffs and cave walls. Many of these motifs would later appear in Meroitic religious iconography, suggesting a continuity not of empire, but of belief. That continuity is perhaps the most remarkable thing. From the Kushite prototype to the rise of Meroe spans thousands of years, and yet the thread does not break. Pottery styles evolve, yes. Languages shift. Political centres move, but the worldview, the reverence for the river, the cattle, the stars, the spirit of kingship that endures, it flows like the Nile itself, bending and turning but never truly stopping. And that brings us to the question of legacy. Why does the Kushite prototype matter? Because it is the missing chapter, the page that was torn from the beginning of the story and forgotten. Egypt may have left more monuments, but Nubia left deeper roots. Its early people pioneered forms of governance, ritual, and expression that would define African civilization for millennia. They were not static tribes. They were dynamic agents of change. In many ways, their silence is what misled us. They wrote little, at least not in stone, but their language was one of design, of rhythm, of pattern. It was spoken in clay and bone, in burial and fire. And if you learn to listen, not with the eyes, but with the hands, you can still hear it, in the curve of a ceramic lip, in the layout of a lost village. in the posture of a ruler buried with a crown. The Kushite prototype was never a footnote. It was the foundation, and it tells us something profound, that civilization does not begin with pyramids or palaces. It begins with memory, with ritual, with the quiet shaping of time into meaning. The early Nubians knew this. They carried it through centuries of silence. And when the moment came when Kerma rose and Napata ruled, and Meroe shined like obsidian in the desert sun, they were ready. But long before those kingdoms had names, their soul had already been born, and it lived in the land where the Nile first remembered how to rise. The Egyptians had a name for the land that bordered them to the south. They called it Tarseti, land of the bow. It was not a poetic title. It was a warning. For in this land, beyond the first cataract of the Nile, lived a people known not just for their archery, but for their pride, their endurance, and their refusal to kneel. To the early Egyptians, Tarseti was both mirror and mystery. It was the first nome of Upper Egypt. Yes, but more than that. It was also a kingdom, possibly the first, a rival, a predecessor, a source of both blood and memory. And in the texts left behind on temple walls and tomb inscriptions, the Egyptians could never quite decide whether these southerners were friend, foe, or family. Some of the earliest mentions of Tarseti date back to the dawn of dynastic Egypt. When Narmer unified the two lands, he did not do so in a vacuum. The Upper Egyptian elites who formed the core of the new state had already been in contact with their Nubian neighbours for centuries. They traded with them, fought with them, married into their lines, and sometimes learned from them, for Tarseti was not an isolated frontier. It was part of the same long Nile corridor. Its people fished the same waters, buried their dead in the same sand, and watched the same stars drift across the desert sky. But where Egypt chose stone and monument, Tarseti moved with rhythm and silence. Their story was not carved, it was carried. That silence, of course, has cost them. Much of what we know about Tarseti comes not from their own words, but from the mouths of their northern rivals. And the Egyptians, masters of narrative, shaped the image of the south to serve their own myths. They spoke of Nubians as wild, dark-skinned archers, as fierce warriors, as bringers of gold, ivory, incense, and exotic animals. Sometimes they were shown bound and defeated beneath the feet of pharaohs. Other times they marched in royal processions, offering tribute with bowed heads. And in still other scenes, they stood as equals, nobles, diplomats, even queens who married into the royal house of Egypt. So, which was true? The answer, as always, is all of it. Tarseti and the broader region of Nubia was never a monolith. It was a mosaic of cultures, clans, and small polities, sometimes united, often fragmented, always moving with the flow of the Nile and the pressures of power. In times of strength, they pressed northward, challenging Egyptian control of key trade routes. In times of weakness, they were absorbed, taxed, and colonized, and in rare moments of harmony, they became partners linked by marriage, treaty, and shared ritual. The phrase, land of the bow, was not just a geographic label. It was a symbol of respect. Even as the Egyptians sought to dominate the south, they never underestimated it. Nubian archers served in Egyptian armies as elite shock troops. Their skills were legendary, their accuracy feared. To call someone from the land of the bow was to acknowledge a lethal grace one earned through generations of hunting, war, and ritual. But beneath the surface, something deeper stirred, a question the Egyptians could never quite resolve. Were the people of Tarseti their enemies? Or their ancestors? There are clues. In the cemeteries of Kustal, as we have seen, Royal tombs with Nubian traits predate the first dynasty of Egypt. The incense burners, the crowns, the ceremonial regalia, all suggest a southern origin, or at least a shared tradition. And as Egyptian civilization grew, it did so by integrating elements long present in the southern Nile: the white crown of Upper Egypt, the veneration of certain southern gods, the cultural memory of kingship flowing from the south to the north. This was not mere influence, it was inheritance. Even the Egyptian word for the south, Kent, means foremost, a place of beginnings, a sacred source. And while the Egyptians wrapped their myths in the language of conquest, they could not erase the echoes. The land of the bow was not just a rival, it was the place they came from. Still, the relationship remained uneasy. During the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian pharaohs built massive fortresses along the southern border, especially in the region of the Second Cataract. These were not trade outposts. They were military garrisons meant to monitor, intimidate, and control. The Egyptians feared a strong southern kingdom rising again. And they were right to fear it, because centuries later, from the ashes of Tarseti and the glory of Kerma, the black pharaohs of Kush would rise. They would not just match Egypt, they would rule it. But even then, the old patterns remained. Friend, foe, ancestor. The roles kept shifting, yet one thing never changed: the bow. The bow was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of reach, of tension, of power held in curved silence. And those who bore it from Tarseti to Meroe never let go of that power, not when they were dismissed as barbarians, not when they were framed as tribute givers, and not when they returned as kings. So when the Egyptians called them the land of the bow, they were doing more than describing geography. They were naming something primal, something they could not conquer, only absorb, a lineage that stretched deeper than their own temples, a rival that was also a root. In the end, Tarseti did not vanish. It became part of Egypt. Yes, but more than that, it became part of Egypt's soul. In every southern campaign, in every desert trade route, in every royal marriage that crossed the border, the memory of Tarseti endured, and the bow never broke. Long before cities rose and kings carved their names into temple stone, there were other carvings, cruder, yes, but no less meaningful. Etched into sandstone cliffs and granite faces, they remained silent, sunburned witnesses to a forgotten world. These are the faces in the rock, the first storytellers of Nubia, and though they left no scrolls and spoke no written language, their voices still echo across the desert. Stretching along the Nile's rocky banks and deep into the arid reaches of the eastern desert are thousands of images, petroglyphs, rock art, line after line of human and animal figures, drawn with purpose, not whim. These engravings span millennia. Some date back more than 8,000 years, to a time when the Sahara still breathed green. Others were made just before the rise of dynastic Egypt, in the hazy space between memory and myth. But all of them, every bull, every boat, every archer, tells us something about the people who made them, who they were, what they feared, what they worshipped, and what they dreamed of becoming. Start with the cattle. Again and again, in sight after sight, the sacred cow appears, sometimes massive, dominating the scene, sometimes accompanied by smaller humans, perhaps herders or priests. The horns are often exaggerated, sweeping, elegant, sometimes curled into near spirals. This was not mere livestock. This was reverence carved into stone, a divine presence. Some cattle are shown being tethered, others ritually adorned. At certain sites, like the eastern desert's Wadi Abu Subaira, cattle are flanked by enigmatic symbols, circles, spirals, even what look like solar discs. Could this be early iconography, a proto-religious language, or simply the mark of ownership, tribe, or lineage? We may never know, but the message is clear. Cattle were more than food. They were life, wealth, ritual, connection to the gods. This cult of cattle would later surface in Egyptian mythology, most notably in the goddess Hathor, protector of kings and mother of the Sunday. But here, in Nubia, we see its earliest artistic form, not in gold and lapis, but scratched into wind-worn rock by calloused hands. And then there are the boats. This is where the carvings grow even stranger. In an age long before written history, we see elegant, curved vessels, sometimes with raised prows and sterns, sometimes filled with lines of figures. These are not simple rafts. They are stylized, deliberate, and they appear in regions where no permanent water remains. What do they mean? Some scholars suggest they represent funerary journeys, proto-versions of the solar bark that would later carry Egyptian pharaohs across the sky. Others believe they mark real river travel along the Nile, proof of early trade and movement between distant communities. Still others say they may have symbolic meaning tied to migration, the wet phases of the Sahara, or even myth. Whatever their purpose, the boats tell us something profound. These people were not static. They moved, they traded, they crossed rivers, perhaps even seas. They saw the world not just as land, but as journey. Beside the cattle and the boats, we also find the warriors, men with bows, spears, raised arms, scenes of conflict, and in some cases, duels, two figures facing off in mirrored stances, as if locked in ritual combat. Are these depictions of real battles, or symbolic contests representing power, bravery, or spiritual trials? At Wadi Sikat Taka Ezaid, one of the more remarkable rock art sites in the eastern desert, a long panel shows what appears to be a procession of armed men moving in a line, weapons raised. Their posture is deliberate, disciplined. They are not raiders. They are soldiers, or perhaps something more, a ritual army. This sense of organized conflict suggests the early stirrings of political identity, of groups fighting not just over food or land, but over control, territory, pride. Here, in these scratches of stone, we glimpse the birth of statehood, long before kings were crowned. Yet not all the art is war and wealth. Some figures are dancing. Some are stretching their arms toward the sky. Some are surrounded by animals, ostriches, gazelles, giraffes. One figure appears to have feathers or rays emanating from its head. A shaman, a god, a memory of someone who once held power over life and death. These scenes feel more intimate, less about conquest, more about community, celebration, grief, transformation. In one haunting panel, a row of human figures appears beneath what may be a crescent moon, heads bowed, arms linked. It is impossible to know the exact meaning, but it feels like mourning or prayer. Taken together, these thousands of images form a kind of social map, a window into the soul of ancient Nubia. They show us that these early people were not primitive. They were not waiting to be civilized by the North. They had culture, complexity, spirit. They marked time with the stars. They moved with the floods. They buried their dead with care. And they carved their memories into stone, not for us, but for themselves, for the gods, for eternity. And still, those memories speak. Not all of the art has survived. Wind and sand have erased many stories. Modern development has scarred some sites. Others lie beneath rising waters or forgotten under shifting dunes. But what remains is enough. more than enough. A chorus of silent storytellers. So, when we speak of early Nubia, we must not look only to pyramids or palaces. We must look to the rocks, to the cliffs, to the desert itself, because it is there, etched in fading lines and sunlit shadows, that the first dreams were drawn. The cattle, the boats, the warriors. These were not decorations, they were declarations. Long before the pyramids of Giza cast shadows across desert sands, before scribes carved the names of pharaohs into granite, before even the Nile had been claimed by gods and kings, there was movement. People moved, goods moved, ideas moved. And in the heart of this ancient motion lay the lifeline between two worlds, Nubia and Egypt. It was not yet Egypt, not fully, just a string of growing settlements along the green spine of the Nile. And Nubia, too, had yet to become Kush or Kerma. But something powerful had already begun, an exchange so old that it predates the concept of kingship itself, an ancient web of trade, stretched across hundreds of miles of river and desert, binding these early societies in ways that would shape the destiny of Africa and beyond. This was not random barter. It was organized, rhythmic, seasonal. A proto-globalization born not of empires, but of need and vision. The land to the south, Nubia, was rich, not in grain or monumental stone, but in treasures the north craved. Gold shimmered in its riverbeds. Ivory lay hidden in elephant graveyards. Incense trees, whose sap would later perfume the temples of Thebes, grew in the highlands. And animals strange, beautiful, fierce, moved through its forests and plains. Giraffes, leopards, monkeys, ostriches, creatures that Egypt would come to revere as gifts of the gods. From as early as the 5th millennium before Christ, signs of this trade appear. Pottery from Nubia has been found in pre-dynastic Egyptian tombs. Carved ivory combs, tooled with fine detail, were placed beside the dead in early burials at Abydos and Hierakonpolis. Shells from the Red Sea coast made their way inland, strung into necklaces worn by those who had never seen the ocean, and pigments rich ochres and deep blacks passed from hand to hand, colouring the earliest expressions of African identity. The Nile was the highway, but it was more than water. It was memory, a map written in flood and silt. Traders moved along it in papyrus boats, their cargo wrapped in reeds and leather. They moved slowly, with the current, stopping at village after village, exchanging not only goods but stories. There were dangers, of course. The cataracts, those roaring stretches of broken rock and rapid, threatened every journey. Bandits lurked in the high cliffs, and mistrust was always possible, especially when a carved bead or bolt of linen was all that stood between peace and violence. But still, the trade continued. It had to. The North needed the South, and the South knew it. Gold was perhaps the most coveted prize. Even before Egypt developed its obsession with eternity, gold held sacred power. It did not tarnish. It caught the sun and held it. It was, in the minds of many, a fragment of the divine, and Nubia had more of it than anyone. The Egyptians would later call Nubia Tarseti and sometimes Tarnersi, but there was another name, whispered through temple corridors, the land of gold. It was no myth. Archaeologists have found traces of ancient mining in Nubian hills, shafts dug with stone tools, veins chipped by hands that never lived to see the kingdom their labour helped build. But the trade was not one way. Nubia did not simply give, it received. From the north came grain, textiles, crafted beads, and ceramics. From Egypt flowed copper tools, fish hooks, and decorative items once reserved only for elites. And with every object passed, so too came ideas, techniques, beliefs. A comb carved in Nubia might one day be shaped like an Egyptian lotus. A pot fired in Egypt might carry motifs learned from the desert clans of the Eastern Sahara. Even burial practices began to blur. In both regions, bodies were now laid on their sides, sometimes accompanied by cattle bones or symbolic offerings, shared symbols, shared rites, shared ancestry perhaps. It is easy to think of globalization as a modern invention of ships and satellites and trade agreements. But here, in this silent world of prehistoric Africa, we find its roots. Movement, exchange, the human urge to connect across distance. And this ancient trade had ripple effects far beyond the Nile. Some goods travelled east, into the Red Sea highlands. Others moved west, across what was then a green and fertile Sahara. Migrating pastoralists, guided by starlight and seasonal winds, carried with them objects and memories. A blade from Upper Egypt, a necklace from Nubia, a dried bundle of incense from the highlands of Punt. These items became more than trade goods. They were carriers of culture. The people who traded did not write. They did not leave contracts or merchant ledgers, but their legacy endures in the artifacts buried in ancient sands. A carved tusk here, a polished stone axe there, patterns of movement preserved not in ink but in dust. And then came the tipping point. As the North began to coalesce into the early dynasties, the relationships shifted. Trade routes hardened into borders. Partners became subjects. The Egyptians, newly crowned with divine kingship, turned their eyes south not as equals, but as rulers. But the old memory remained. The knowledge that before the pharaohs built pyramids, before they claimed the sun and the stars, they had looked south. They had looked to Nubia for gold, for wisdom, for origin. And so, though the trade became conquest and the gifts became tribute, the bond endured, even in the heart of empire. Beneath layers of stone and myth, the early trade routes whispered a truth the pharaohs could not bury, that long before they ruled, they had followed, and that somewhere, far upriver, a quiet people with dark skin and keen eyes had watched the boats drift north full of treasures, yes, but also full of dreams. Beneath the drifting sands of Lower Nubia, buried in silence and sediment, lie the graves of monarchs who ruled before history had a name for them. No scrolls bear their words, no pyramids speak their glory, but in places like Kustal, a whisper rises from the tombs, one that challenges everything we thought we knew about where kingship truly began. These were not simple burials. They were orchestrated farewells, structured, deliberate, and symbolic. At Kustal, nestled just south of the Egyptian border, archaeologists uncovered royal tombs older than the earliest dynasties of Egypt. Radiocarbon dating places some of these burials around 3,300 years before Christ, predating Egypt's first dynasty by nearly 2 centuries. But it is not just the age that stuns, it is the detail. Inside one of the most prominent tombs, Tomb L24, was found a ceremonial incense burner. Carved into it was the image of a boat. A ruler sat aboard, wearing what appears to be the white crown of Upper Egypt, flanked by symbols of power, a falcon, a rosette, and a standard. The scene is unmistakably regal, and yet it was Nubian. This incense burner alone has rewritten chapters. For decades, Egypt was seen as the singular cradle of African kingship, the land where divine rule was invented. But here, in the dark soil of Nubia, was proof that the South had not only kings, but rituals, regalia, and symbols that would later be absorbed into Egyptian statecraft. Who were these forgotten kings? We may never know their names. No writing system survived their reigns. Their language is lost, but their graves tell us they were powerful. In some tombs, retainers were buried alongside the king, suggesting sacrifice, or at least ritual death, to accompany him into the next world. In others, finely crafted pottery, carved ivory, and jewelry speak to wide trade networks and deep cultural refinement. One of the most intriguing finds was a throne platform elevated, flanked by posts, possibly once draped in fabric or adorned with banners. Its design, primitive though it may appear, mirrors the elevated dais later used in pharaonic coronations, a place for the king to rise above his people, both literally and symbolically. In other tombs, processional scenes are carved into surviving artifacts, lines of figures bearing fans, standards, and offerings. The symmetry is striking. From posture to costume to ceremonial order, these processions mirror what will one day be seen in Egyptian temple reliefs centuries later. Did Egypt borrow this from Nubia? Or did both inherit from a common ancestral culture along the Nile? Some scholars argue for diffusion, others for parallel development, but the timing is undeniable. The coastal elites ruled while Egypt was still coalescing into city-states. The proto-kingdoms of Upper Egypt, Nekada, Hierakonpolis, were not yet unified under Narmer, and yet, to the south, a royal tradition had already formed. This is the uncomfortable truth. Egypt, for all its magnificence, did not rise in isolation. Its roots are tangled with the cultures to the south, and in Kustul, those roots run deep. The white crown, later the symbol of Upper Egyptian kings, appears in Nubia first. The falcon, which would later become Horus, the divine protector of pharaohs, also appears early in Nubian iconography. Standards and royal fans, used in coronation ceremonies throughout dynastic Egypt, were etched into Nubian artifacts generations before the Egyptian state emerged. And while the Egyptians later depicted Nubians as outsiders, exotic, sometimes hostile, often subordinate their own foundations, suggest a more complex truth. Egypt did not conquer an empty land. It inherited a legacy. It merged with an already existing aristocracy. The rulers of Kustul were not pharaohs, but they were kings, and their echoes lived on. There is another clue: the tombs themselves. Unlike the later mastabas of Egypt, the royal graves at Kustul were built in circular or oval shapes, often sunk into the earth and roofed with timber. They were rich, but not ostentatious, modest in scale, yet heavy with meaning. And in their layout, we see early attempts at cosmic alignment, burials facing certain directions, offerings placed in patterns. This was not random. It was liturgy in dirt and stone. Even the use of incense burners suggests ritual, a practice that would later be central to Egyptian temple life, purifying the air, pleasing the gods, guiding the soul. But here, in Nubia, we find the roots of that scent, curling through time like smoke rising from a forgotten altar. It is no longer possible to speak of early kingship in Africa without naming Kustul, without acknowledging the southern throne. And yet, they remain shadows, the forgotten kings, their language silenced, their cities, perhaps swallowed by time or flood, their names erased, not by malice, but by the erosion of memory. Still, their legacy is not gone. In the falcon, etched into Egyptian standards, there is a memory of them. In the white crown worn by Narmer, there is a tribute. In the solar boat that carried dead pharaohs into eternity, there is a whisper of Nubian reeds and southern craftsmanship. History is not always written in ink. Sometimes it is buried, sometimes it is carved, sometimes it is burned into an incense tray, left in a royal tomb beneath the Nubian sun. And sometimes, if we listen carefully, it speaks again. Because long before the pyramids rose from the sands, kings walked the Nile. Their crowns were tall, their thrones were set upon earth, their power was real, and their time, though forgotten, was first. The desert wind carries secrets older than empires, and among them is a single object that might rewrite the origin story of one of the most iconic symbols of human civilization. It is small, fragile, made to burn incense, and yet it burns something deeper, an idea, a memory, a challenge. The Khustal incense burner, unearthed from a royal tomb just south of Egypt's ancient border, carries an image that stares straight into the heart of Egyptian myth, and it asks a single unsettling question. What if the pharaohs were not first? This burner is no ordinary artifact. It was discovered in the 1970s during excavations in Lower Nubia at a burial site called Khustal. This was a place where kings were laid to rest long before Egypt's first dynasty ever carved a name into stone. In one particular tomb, known to archaeologists as L24, a wide ceramic burner was found, decorated with incised lines. Its artwork is crude by later standards, but the symbolism is unmistakable. A procession, a boat, standards waving, and at the centre, a seated figure wearing what appears to be the white crown of Upper Egypt, a Nubian king, in pharaonic dress, centuries before Egypt had a king. This was not a coincidence of fashion. The details are too aligned. The shape of the crown, the posture of authority, the presence of the falcon, later to be Horus, protector of the pharaohs. Even the ritual boat, gliding through afterlife waters or solar cycles, mirrors the divine barks that would later ferry gods and kings through temples and across cosmic realms. Scholars were stunned, because if this interpretation holds, it suggests something revolutionary, that the symbols of Egyptian kingship so central, so defining, so sacred, may have first taken form in Nubia. What if the crown, the throne, the divine order of rule did not originate in Memphis or Abydos, but in a Nubian court long forgotten? What if the pharaohs, for all their grandeur, inherited their most sacred emblems from the people they would later call foreigners? To understand the weight of this, you must understand the crown itself. Egypt had two main crowns, the red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt. When united, they formed the double crown, symbolizing a king who ruled both lands. The white crown, called the Hedjet, was tall and conical, and it is this crown that appears on the Khustal incense burner long before the earliest known depiction of an Egyptian king wearing it. It is not the only anomaly. Other artifacts from the same site show processions of standards, nearly identical to those later carried before pharaohs. These standards bore sacred emblems, like the jackal, the falcon, and the rosette, all later adopted into Egyptian religious and royal iconography. Some pottery even features motifs that suggest early forms of royal protocol. Lines of attendance, offerings, animal sacrifices, all carefully arranged, all intentionally displayed. This raises another question. Was Egypt influenced by Nubia through trade and cultural contact, or was early Egyptian kingship a direct evolution of Nubian ritual? It is difficult to say with certainty. The record is fragmented. The Nile has both revealed and swallowed its past. But what is clear is this. The Nubian rulers of Khustal had developed complex funerary practices, religious symbolism, and expressions of centralized power long before Nama's palette recorded the mythical unification of Egypt. And Khustal was not a minor village. It was a royal seat, commanding territory and trade. Located near the First Cataract, it stood as a southern gateway to the Nile, a borderland between two worlds, a place of convergence and competition, and perhaps origin. If the incense burner truly shows a Nubian king in pharaonic iconography, then Egypt's royal institution did not arise in isolation. It absorbed, it borrowed, it transformed southern models into its own northern mythology, which means the birth of the pharaoh was not a single event, but a process woven from older threads stretching upriver. This is where history becomes myth, and myth becomes memory. Later, Egyptian texts speak of Tarseti, the land of the bow, as both a rival and a mystery, sometimes hostile, sometimes noble, but always there, an other that was, in truth, a brother, and perhaps a father. The earliest Egyptian dynasties did not erase these southern roots. They simply folded them into their own identity. Quietly, completely, the incense burner of Khustal is small. It would fit in the hands of a priest. Its function was spiritual, its purpose ephemeral, to release fragrance into the air, to purify a ritual space, to connect the mortal and the divine. But in its carved surface, it preserves a snapshot of authority, ritual, and visual language that would come to define centuries of Egyptian rule. Why does this matter? Because it reminds us that civilizations do not emerge in vacuums. They are born from contact, from movement, from legacy. Egypt did not rise fully formed from the banks of the Nile. It was shaped by those who came before. And the Khustal incense burner, silent, blackened by time, bears witness to a chapter long omitted from the grand narrative. Nubia was not just a neighbour, it was a cradle. The white crown of Upper Egypt, the falcon of Horus, the royal bark gliding through eternity. These were not inventions of a single dynasty. They were echoes. Echoes of incense smoke in a Nubian tomb. Echoes of a king whose name we may never know, but whose crown still lingers in stone and story. And so, as the modern world gazes in awe at Egypt's monuments, it is worth turning our eyes southward, to the hills of Khustal, to the forgotten thrones, to the crown before the crown, because in the shifting sands of time, truth is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is carved into clay, burned by incense, and buried with a king no one remembers until now, beneath the golden sun that once shimmered over the lush valleys of the southern Nile. Ideas were born, symbols, rituals, and images that would outlive the people who created them. Long before towering obelisks and the chiseled faces of pharaohs, before temple walls told stories of gods and conquest, something older stirred in the south. A current of cultural inheritance flowed upstream, carrying the seeds of what would one day blossom into ancient Egypt's unmistakable visual language. And though the world remembers pyramids and papyrus, fewer recall the lands that whispered the first hieroglyphs in shadows. Egypt's grandeur was never a self-contained miracle. It was a crescendo of many voices. And some of the earliest were Nubian. From the incense burners of Khustal to the cattle graves of Nabta Playa, from desert rock art to funerary rituals in forgotten tombs, the evidence mounts. Egypt did not invent everything it later refined. It inherited, it absorbed, it reimagined. Consider the crown, not the double crown that united Upper and Lower Egypt, but the tall white crown worn by rulers of the south. Its earliest known depiction was not in Memphis or Thebes, but in Nubia. On that weathered incense burner found at Khustal, a king sits aboard a sacred boat, crowned not with a crude headdress, but with the hedjet, the very crown that would one day rest on the head of Narmer, Egypt's first dynastic ruler. The implication is enormous. The iconography of kingship, long thought to be born on Egyptian soil, may have first risen with Nubian rulers who vanished before their stories could be written. Then there is the cobra, the uraeus. Curled and poised atop the foreheads of Egyptian rulers, the serpent became a symbol of divine authority, a protector of the king, and a sign that the gods had chosen him to rule. but serpents held meaning in many African traditions. Among pastoralist cultures to the south, snakes represented fertility, wisdom, and danger. In Nubian art and symbolism, the serpent appears as guardian and guide. Did Egypt shape the cobra anew, or did it simply place an old symbol upon a new brow? And what of the falcon? The falcon is perhaps the most enduring image of Egyptian sovereignty. Horus, the sky god, the divine eye, the guardian of kings, his wings stretched across temple walls, his eye painted on coffins, his form soaring in stone. But the falcon too predates dynastic Egypt. In Nubian grave goods and ceremonial items, falcon motifs appear silent, watchful, powerful. Was Horus born on Egyptian soil, or was he flown in from the desert cliffs of the south, his wings already outstretched over kings whose names are lost to time? The river itself offers a clue. Along the Nile, trade did more than move ivory and gold. It carried gods, it carried myths, it carried ritual. One of the oldest and most sacred rites in Egypt was the solar boat, the vessel that ferried Ra across the sky by day and through the underworld by night. Great funerary boats were buried beside pharaohs to ensure their souls could sail into eternity. But the concept of the sacred boat, of celestial journey through water, may have an even earlier home. In the deserts of Nubia and the Eastern Sahara, rock art depicts boats long before pyramids were built. These were not fishing vessels. They were ceremonial, lined with standards, crewed by figures in procession. The imagery echoes across time. The boat as symbol of power, of transition, of the soul's journey beyond death. Egypt would one day enshrine these beliefs in its theology, build boat-shaped temples, and bury full-size ships next to kings. But the metaphor may have floated up from the south. None of this diminishes Egypt's genius. Quite the opposite. Egypt was a master of synthesis. It took the beliefs and symbols of surrounding peoples and elevated them, polished them into gold, carved them into granite, aligned them with stars. But recognizing the southern roots of these ideas does something crucial. It reminds us that greatness often grows from shared soil. The Nile was not a line, it was a braid, a tangle of stories, beliefs, and identities. And as early Egypt began to coalesce into a unified state, its rulers looked both north and south. They drew upon the sacred cows of the Eastern Sahara, the royal regalia of Nubia, the cosmology of desert wanderers and river kings. They took the cobra and the crown, the falcon and the boat, and made them Egyptian. But the echoes of their origin remained. Even the gods themselves bear traces of cultural blending. Hathor, often depicted as a cow or with cow horns, echoes older cattle cults that stretched far into Nubia and the Sahara. The reverence of cattle as both sustenance and sacred symbol was deeply embedded in African pastoralist cultures. Likewise, the worship of deities tied to fertility, water, and the sky themes central to Nubian and Saharan spirituality found new life in Egypt's expanding pantheon. And so, Egypt did not rise alone. Its visual language, so rich, so enduring, was built on foundations laid by others. The pharaoh's crown was shaped by kings buried in forgotten desert tombs. The serpent on his brow once slithered across southern altars. The falcon that guarded him once flew above the cliffs of a Nubian court. The solar bark that carried him to eternity once floated through a different cosmos, sketched in ochre on stone. This is the truth history often resists. That greatness is rarely singular. That civilizations are mosaics, not monoliths. That behind every empire lies a chorus of voices, some remembered, many silenced. But the Nile remembers. Its waters still flow past Kustal and Kerma, past forgotten cities and sacred hills. And if you stand there, If you listen to the wind, you might hear it, the rustle of wings, the hiss of a serpent, the creak of a boat sliding into the afterlife, and a whisper from the south saying, "We were here, we came first, we gave what we had," and Egypt remembered. The wind that once carried whispers of kingship across the southern Nile now blows over a silence. Where once Tarseti stood proud, a kingdom of archers, cattle herders, sacred rites, and early thrones, there is now dust, traces in the earth, broken pottery, crumbled tombs, forgotten names. It is easy to look north to Egypt and see only ascendance, temples rising, pyramids growing, dynasties unfolding. But to understand how that ascent happened, one must also look south, not just at what Egypt built, but at what faded away to make space for its rise. Tarseti, the land of the bow, once dominated this stretch of the Nile. Its kings ruled from Kustal and beyond. Its warriors were feared, its rituals elaborate, its symbology strikingly similar to the pharaohs who would follow. And yet, by the time Egypt was carving its earliest names into stone, Tarseti was crumbling. What happened? How could a kingdom so advanced, so rich in culture and order, collapse into obscurity? The answer, as always, lies in the convergence of many forces, not a single event, but a slow unravelling. And it begins with the land itself. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was not the lifeless expanse we know today. It was green, it was alive, rainfall came regularly, grasslands stretched wide, lakes shimmered in the sun, and rivers braided through valleys. This was the environment that gave birth to early African civilizations, including the ancestors of Tarseti. People moved freely between grazing lands and floodplains, hunting, herding, and planting. Societies grew, not in spite of the desert, but because the desert was not yet a desert. But the climate was changing. By around 4,500 BCE, the African humid period was ending. Rain began to withdraw, slowly at first, then more drastically. Lakes dried up, the savanna receded, wind patterns shifted. The once fertile Sahara began its long transformation into a sea of sand. And for kingdoms like Tarseti, this meant pressure. Less land to graze cattle, fewer crops, more mouths. Rivers that once carried boats now revealed their rocky beds. Nomadic groups who had long lived on the margins began to move inward, searching for new sustenance. Competition for water intensified. Pastoralists clashed with settled communities. Trade routes faltered. The kingdom's lifelines, its sacred cattle, its control over river crossings, its cultural connections grew fragile. But it was not only nature that turned against Tarseti. The tides of power were shifting. To the north, small chiefdoms along the Nile Delta and Upper Egypt were becoming more organized. Centers like Abydos and Hierakonpolis were gaining strength. Agricultural innovation, increasing population, and the strategic location of these proto-Egyptian states positioned them to rise just as Tarseti weakened. And here, geography played a cruel joke. The Nile flows from south to north. Ideas, goods, and influence can travel upstream, but power, most often, flows downstream. As Upper Egypt began consolidating, it did so with both reverence and rivalry toward its southern neighbour. Early Egyptian rulers adopted the crowns and symbols of Tarseti, but they also sought to eclipse them. There is evidence that Egypt's first unifiers may have clashed with Tarseti. Narmer, the king often credited with uniting Upper and Lower Egypt, is shown smiting foreign enemies, some of whom bear southern features. In later dynasties, Egypt would campaign aggressively into Nubia, seeking control over gold mines, trade routes, and border security. These later invasions suggest a long-standing dynamic, admiration mixed with conquest. But perhaps Egypt never needed to invade Tarseti directly. Perhaps the collapse was already underway, weakened by climate shifts, fragmented by internal strife, and slowly outcompeted by rising powers to the north. Tarseti may have simply lost its grip. Its elites buried their kings, burned their incense, and watched their sacred symbols migrate upriver, where they would be reborn in Egyptian temples. In archaeology, the evidence of collapse is rarely dramatic. More often, it is the absence of renewal, fewer grave goods, simpler tombs, abandoned settlements, a slow fading of complexity. At sites like Kustal, the richness of earlier burials gives way to more modest offerings. Trade items become scarcer, the craftsmanship declines. The story doesn't end in fire and ruin. It ends in silence. Yet the legacy of Tarseti did not vanish. Egypt remembered. It remembered in the shape of its crowns, the symbols of its gods, the structure of its royal courts. It remembered in how it defined kingship, divinity, and warfare. The land of the bow became a phrase inscribed in Egyptian texts, not as a distant mystery, but as a known place. Sometimes enemy, sometimes tribute giver, sometimes a source of sacred power. Even as Egypt built its own mythology of divine rule, the shadows of Tarseti lingered, the memory of a kingdom that once taught the Nile how to wear a crown, that carved symbols into incense burners, that buried its kings beneath stars, that watched the rain go, the green fade, the desert advance. Today, Tarseti lies beneath layers of time. It is not in most textbooks. Its name does not echo like Thebes or Memphis. But its collapse was not just an ending, it was a handoff, a cultural baton passed from one civilization to the next. And if you listen closely, beneath the roar of Egyptian grandeur, you can still hear the whispers of the bowmen, the cattle herders, the desert kings who came before, because no empire rises in a vacuum, and every crown is forged in the shadow of one that came before. History is a mirror, but not always a faithful one. Sometimes it is sanded smooth. Sometimes it is cracked. Sometimes it reflects only what the victors allow us to see. Ancient Egypt, towering in its grandeur and carved into eternity in stone, built more than pyramids, it built a story of divine kings, orderly dynasties, and a people destined to rule the Nile. But beneath that carefully etched surface, there are missing lines, silenced voices, and borrowed echoes. And chief among those echoes is the forgotten kingdom of Tarseti. Egypt did not begin in a vacuum. It did not spring fully formed from the desert like a miracle. It was built on the bones and wisdom of earlier cultures, absorbed, adapted, refined, and, at times, erased. Tarseti, the powerful Nubian kingdom that flourished along the southern Nile before Egypt's first dynasty was born, stands as one of the clearest examples of this buried legacy. The question is not whether Egypt learned from Tarseti. The question is how much it chose to forget. When Egyptian scribes began recording the deeds of their kings, they did so with divine authority. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler, he was a god on earth. His right to rule was eternal, unchallenged, and uniquely Egyptian. And yet, many of the symbols of that authority, the white crown, the cobra, the falcon, the solar barque, can be traced further south. The incense burner at Kustal, dating back to before Egypt's first dynasty, shows a king seated on a throne, wearing a tall white crown, aboard a sacred boat. It is an image nearly identical to those found in early Egyptian royal iconography. But it came first. So why is that king not named in Egyptian records? Why does the kingdom of Tarseti, which ruled the Nile's southern stretches for centuries, barely appear except as a vague land of the bow to be fought or feared. Why do the artifacts speak louder than the texts? The answer lies in the way Egypt constructed its identity, not as one civilization among many, but as the civilization, a divine order in a chaotic world. Foreign lands were not equals. They were enemies, subjects, or curiosities. Nubia, even in the earliest dynasties, was often framed as wild, gold-rich, and in need of control. Egyptian inscriptions portray southern peoples being smitten, tribute being taken, boundaries being secured. Rarely do they mention that some of the rituals they cherished most may have originated in those very lands. It is possible, likely even, that Egypt deliberately rewrote the past, not with lies, but with silence, by excluding names, ignoring shared symbols, and burying earlier narratives under layers of stone and decree. They shaped a story where Egypt was always first, always chosen, always supreme. This was not merely political, it was theological. In Egypt's worldview, Ma'at cosmic order had to be preserved. The king, as the living embodiment of Ma'at, had to represent continuity and legitimacy. Acknowledging foreign origins would have introduced uncertainty. If the first kings learned from Nubian rulers, what did that say about divine inheritance? If sacred symbols were borrowed, were they truly Egyptian? Better, then, to absorb. Better to take the crown, the god, the ritual, and make it one's own, to write it anew in hieroglyphs, to depict it on temple walls with a different face, to bury it in the sands of memory. And over time, the sands obeyed. Even modern archaeology has been shaped by this ancient erasure. For decades, Egyptology focused on the grandeur of dynasties and tombs, often ignoring the deep cultural exchange with Nubia and other southern regions. Excavations prioritized pyramids over pottery, temples over trade routes. It is only in recent decades that scholars have begun to reassemble the southern story, a story Egypt never told in full. Yet the evidence cannot be buried forever. In the royal cemeteries of Kustul, in the cattle cults of Nabta Playa, in the rock art of the Eastern Desert, and in the architecture of early Nubian centres like Kerma, we find the outlines of a different history, one in which Egypt did not arise alone, but with help, one in which the symbols of statecraft and divinity were not born on the banks of the Nile Delta, but further south, where the river ran narrower, the cliffs steeper, and the kings older. Tarseti was not just a precursor, it was a parent, and like many children of power, Egypt honoured its parent by forgetting it. Still, memory has a way of surviving where writing fails. The southern bow remained a symbol of strength in Egyptian texts. The Nubians were never truly erased. They were turned into rivals, then subjects, then symbols. In later centuries, long after Egypt's own golden age had passed, Nubian kingdoms like Napata and Meroe would rise again, not as students, but as pharaohs. In the 25th dynasty, Nubian kings would conquer Egypt itself, restoring old temples, reviving lost rites, and wearing the crowns their ancestors once inspired. It was a strange full circle. A kingdom once buried by silence returned to rule the very land that had forgotten it. But this time, their names were remembered. Pianki, Shabaka, Tahaka. They were not called foreigners. They were called kings. Today, as we peel back the layers of sand and story, a new image emerges. Not a rivalry, but a relay. Not a theft, but a torch passed. Egypt's grandeur remains undeniable, but it is no longer alone in the spotlight. In the shadows behind the pyramids, a bow is strung, a crown is carved, a boat is readied for the stars. Tarseti speaks again, not through monuments, but through the fragments it left behind. And those fragments are finally being heard, because victors may write history, but the past belongs to all who search for it. The desert winds carried new names, but the spirit of the old kingdom remained. Where Tarseti had once ruled the southern Nile with pride and ritual, a new power now rose Kerma, born from the ashes of forgotten dynasties and cradled by the same river that nourished empires. Kerma did not merely survive in the wake of Egypt's rise, it flourished. And for nearly 1,000 years, it stood as both a rival and a reflection of Egypt's greatness. The story of Kerma begins not in conquest, but in continuity. Long after the decline of Tarseti, the people of Nubia remained. They did not disappear when their temples quieted or their tombs were sealed. They moved, adapted, endured. The Nile remained their anchor. And along a fertile stretch near the Third Cataract, a city began to grow Kerma. It was not a sudden eruption, but a steady ascension. From small farming villages and trading outposts, a central authority emerged. Around 2,500 years before the birth of Christ, Kerma began to take shape as a kingdom in its own right. It was a kingdom unlike anything Egypt expected. At its height, Kerma was a metropolis of sprawling mud-brick compounds, ceremonial centres, and massive burial mounds known as tumuli. Its architecture was sophisticated, its artisans skilled, its people proud. What Egypt viewed as the wild lands of the south were, in reality, the grounds of a thriving civilization with its own gods, its own kings, and its own destiny. Kerma was not a province, it was a power, and Egypt noticed. The relationship between Egypt and Kerma was never simple. It oscillated between war and trade, fear and fascination. Egyptian pharaohs referred to Kerma and Greater Nubia as the vile land of Kush. But that vilification belied a deep dependency. From Kerma came gold, ivory, ebony, incense, exotic animals, and soldiers. Nubian archers were renowned for their accuracy and ferocity. Caravans and riverboats passed between the two kingdoms, carrying goods and sometimes spies. Yet beneath the commerce simmered tension. Egypt feared what Kerma could become, and they were right to fear. Around the time of Egypt's Middle Kingdom, Kerma reached its peak. Its kings wore crowns of their own. Its priests officiated at grand temples. Its nobles were buried with wealth, rivaling that of Egyptian elites. At the centre of the city stood the Western Defufa, a massive structure of mud brick used for religious and possibly political purposes, rising several stories above the desert. It signalled to all who approached that Kerma was no backwater. It was a capital. The burial sites alone speak volumes. In the royal cemeteries, hundreds of human and animal sacrifices were laid beside the dead, suggesting a belief in divine kingship and an afterlife ruled by ancestral power. These were not hastily assembled graves. They were carefully planned, deeply symbolic, and grand in scale. They tell us that Kerma's kings saw themselves not as regional chieftains, but as rightful lords of the Nile. And then came the war. During the Second Intermediate Period, when Egypt was divided and weakened by the rule of the Hyksos in the north, Kerma struck, under a powerful king whose name is still debated. Kerma launched military campaigns deep into Upper Egypt. At one point, Kerma's forces reached as far north as Aswan and possibly beyond. Egyptian texts describe the devastation. Temples burned, statues smashed, cities abandoned. In a stunning reversal, the south had invaded the north. For a brief moment, it seemed that Kerma might do what no other African kingdom had done, conquer Egypt. But empires are seldom conquered in full. Egypt eventually reasserted itself. As the 18th dynasty rose and the pharaohs of Thebes expelled the Hyksos, their attention turned south. They remembered Kerma's audacity, and they vowed to end it. Thutmose I led campaigns deep into Nubian territory, striking hard at Kerma's heart. Temples were desecrated, towns were seized, the royal court was shattered. By the reign of Thutmose III, Egypt had annexed Nubia, transforming the once independent kingdom into a colony governed by viceroys and watched by soldiers. But even in defeat, Kerma left an imprint. Its cultural foundations would not vanish with conquest. Its gods were folded into Egyptian religion. Its symbols were reinterpreted in Egyptian art. Its legacy would live on in the next great Nubian power, Napata, and the eventual Kushite kings who would return, centuries later, to sit on Egypt's throne as pharaohs. Was Kerma the spiritual successor to Tarseti? In many ways, yes. The geography, the rituals, the reverence for the river and the cattle, these were not new. They were inherited, evolved. While the names changed, the soul of Nubia remained, and Kerma, more than a kingdom, became a bridge between the ancient south and the dynastic north. What makes Kerma remarkable is not only that it challenged Egypt, but that it did so on its own terms. It did not mimic. It did not bow. Its kings did not model themselves after pharaohs. They wore different robes. They prayed to different gods. They built cities from different earth. And yet, in their independence, they forced Egypt to reckon with the truth civilization did not begin and end in Memphis or Thebes. The Nile had many cradles. Kerma was one of them. Today, the ruins of Kerma still rise from the desert, weathered but defiant. The western Defufa casts its long shadow, a reminder that before empire became myth, before maps drew hard borders, the river nurtured many dreams. Kerma's voice may be quieter than Egypt's, but it still speaks. It speaks of pride, of resistance, of rebirth, and of a kingdom that remembered where it came from, even as the world tried to forget. The river had always flowed from south to north, carving life into the desert and binding kingdoms in an unbreakable chain of water, trade, and memory. But power along the Nile was not so simple. Egypt, with its towering monuments and divine kingship, often painted itself as the sole master of the Nile. Yet to the south, where the cataracts churned and the cliffs narrowed, another power stirred, a power Egypt could never fully ignore. That power was Nubia, and the waters between them would soon run red with war. From the earliest dynasties, Egypt's relationship with Nubia was defined by duality, envy and exploitation, reverence and resistance. The riches of the southern lands tempted every ruler who sat on a throne in Thebes or Memphis. Gold gleamed in the hills beyond the first cataract. Cattle roamed in great herds across fertile floodplains. Incense and ivory filled Nubian markets. And perhaps, most dangerously, independence echoed in Nubian temples. Egyptian texts often referred to Nubia with terms that betrayed both fascination and fear. The land of the bow, they called it. The term was not poetic, it was tactical. The Nubians were famed archers. Their skill so deadly that Egyptian armies would recruit them as mercenaries, even while branding their homelands as rebellious. It was a paradox. Egypt never fully resolved, admire the people, but dominate the place. In the Middle Kingdom, Egypt began to tighten its grip. Fortresses sprang up along the southern frontier, Buhen, Semna, and others designed not only to guard trade routes, but to monitor and restrict Nubian movement. Stone walls and watchtowers overlooked the river like clenched fists. But even stone cannot dam ambition. Kerma, the Nubian kingdom that had grown powerful and proud, pushed back, and Egypt, reeling from internal divisions and foreign threats, could not stop them. During the chaos of the Second Intermediate Period, while the Hyksos controlled the north and the pharaohs clung to Upper Egypt, Kerma launched bold strikes across the border. Temples in Elephantine were defiled. Egyptian fortresses fell. For a fleeting moment, Nubia reclaimed what had once been its own, and perhaps dreamed of taking more. But Egypt would not stay fractured forever. When the 18th dynasty rose in Thebes, it did so with fire in its veins. The pharaohs who came after Ahmose knew that to restore Egypt's greatness, they had to secure its borders, and the south, proud, powerful, and defiant, would be the proving ground. Thutmose I was not content with rebuilding temples or reorganizing cities. He was a warrior king, forged in the crucible of conflict, and in the 5th year of his reign, he turned his gaze toward Nubia. The campaign that followed was swift, brutal, and relentless. Egyptian armies moved down the Nile with precision, backed by chariots, boats, and the full weight of a revitalized state. They struck at key cities and religious centers, sending a clear message Egypt had returned, and it demanded obedience. According to inscriptions, Thutmose sailed past the Third Cataract, deeper into Nubia than any pharaoh before him. He claimed victory over rebellious chiefs and established new boundaries marked by royal stelae carved into the rock. One such inscription, discovered at Tombos, boasts of the king's triumphs and declares his might in terms that blend divine right with military conquest. The gods favoured Egypt, it said, and the south would kneel. But conquest, as always, is not just about battle. It is about water. Control the Nile, and you control life itself. Thutmose and his successors knew this. By placing Egyptian garrisons near key cataracts and trade points, they could monitor river flow, restrict Nubian trade, and redirect the currents of power. War was not just fought with swords and bows. It was fought with boats, canals, and diplomacy. And in that arena, Egypt proved cunning, yet Nubia did not disappear. It adapted. Under pressure, the people of the south reshaped their strategies. Some communities moved further upriver, out of easy reach. Others integrated into Egyptian systems as local governors or temple officials, maintaining their traditions while wearing Egyptian robes, and in the shadows of Egyptian temples, Nubian gods continued to whisper. The conflict between Egypt and Nubia was not a single war. It was a series of contests, military, spiritual, and cultural, played out over centuries. Sometimes Egypt won, establishing puppet rulers or extracting tribute. Sometimes Nubia struck back, toppling outposts or asserting its autonomy. But always, the river flowed between them, binding them in a relationship too deep to sever. In time, Egypt's dominance would wane, and when it did, the south would rise again. But that story belongs to another chapter. What remains clear is this: Egypt feared Nubia, not because it was different, but because it was familiar. It held a mirror to the north, reflecting power, pride, and divine ambition. In every southern king, Egypt saw a shadow of its own pharaoh, and in every Nubian temple, a reminder that the Nile did not begin in Egypt. War and water, arrows and offerings, kings and cataracts. The struggle between Egypt and Nubia was more than politics. It was a reckoning between two civilizations, shaped by the same river, but chasing different destinies. And the river, patient and eternal, watched it all unfold. The sun-baked hills of Nubia shimmered with more than heat. Beneath layers of rock and sand, veins of gold snaked through the earth like arteries of forgotten kings. To the Egyptians, the south was not just a land of mystery, it was a treasure vault, and nothing glinted brighter in their imagination or their ambition the Nubian gold. Long before Egypt built its first pyramid, the allure of Nubian resources had already taken root. The Nile flowed north, but dreams of wealth pulled pharaohs south. Nubia's mines, deep in the deserts east of the river, yielded the kind of gold that could buy loyalty, build temples, and dazzle gods. It was not just precious, it was sacred. Offerings of gold were given to the sun god Ra, fashioned into funerary masks, and woven into the identity of the divine king. To be wealthy in gold was to walk in the company of eternity, and Nubia had it in abundance. Egyptian texts refer to the southern land with a phrase both admiring and possessive, the land of gold. That phrase alone reveals the truth. Egypt did not see Nubia as merely a neighbour or a rival kingdom. It saw it as a mine, a place to extract, not a people to respect. And from the earliest dynasties, expeditions were launched with one goal: bring back the gleam of the gods. These weren't simple trading missions. They were state-sanctioned campaigns of resource acquisition. Pharaohs outfitted fleets of ships and columns of soldiers to journey deep into Nubian territory. They built way stations and forts along the river. They mapped the terrain. They recruited miners, sometimes free labourers, often captives, and sent them into the blistering heat to chip at the rocks, day and night. For every nugget extracted, another life was spent. One of the earliest recorded gold expeditions dates back to the reign of Pharaoh Djer, a ruler of Egypt's first dynasty. That alone places the Egyptian hunger for Nubian gold at over 5,000 years ago. Even then, the pattern was clear: march south, take the gold, return in glory. Later, under the 18th dynasty, this hunger would become an imperial obsession. Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, led multiple campaigns into Nubia. Inscriptions celebrate his victories not just in terms of territory but in weight. They detail the amount of gold seized as tribute or spoils. Sometimes the texts exaggerate, claiming tribute too abundant to count. But behind the boasting lies a deeper truth. Egypt's empire was gilded with Nubian blood. This gold wasn't just decoration. It financed temples, palaces, and military expeditions. It flowed through the veins of the Egyptian economy. Without Nubia's mines, the great monuments of Thebes and Karnak may never have reached such grandeur. The very concept of divine kingship, Pharaoh as the living god, was reinforced by gold regalia, golden thrones, and golden burial chambers. Gold didn't just serve power, it became its symbol. Yet the hunger for gold warped Egypt's relationship with Nubia. It reduced an ancient, complex culture to a resource pit. It justified military invasions, cultural suppression, and forced labour. Egypt would often frame its southern campaigns as civilizing missions. But when you peel back the hieroglyphs and read between the lines, you see the core motivation wasn't enlightenment, it was extraction. Even in the tombs of Egyptian officials, the evidence glitters. In the burial chamber of Rekhmire, a vizier under Thutmose III, painted scenes show Nubian chiefs bringing tribute: gold rings, leopard skins, and ivory tusks. They are shown bowing low, humbled before Egypt's throne. But these images were not objective records. They were imperial propaganda. They told the story Egypt wanted to believe, that Nubia existed to serve. And yet, gold does not come quietly. Every shipment was a risk, every mine a frontier. Raiding parties struck Egyptian caravans. Local resistance simmered just below the surface. The mines, though lucrative, were remote and deadly. The deeper Egypt dug, the more it had to fear revolt. At times, entire Nubian regions rebelled, fueled by resentment and the loss of autonomy. And while Egypt often crushed these uprisings, it never fully broke the will of the people. There were also spiritual consequences. By linking gold so closely with divinity, Egypt bound itself to Nubia in a way it could not escape. The gold from Nubian mines adorned the gods themselves. In a sense, Nubia became sacred. Yet instead of honouring that connection, Egypt exploited it. They poured Nubian gold into the mouths of statues, but silenced the voices of those who mined it. Modern archaeology has uncovered the remains of these ancient operations. Crude tools, broken camps, and scarred rock faces speak of backbreaking labour. Some mines, like those at Wadi al-Laki and the Eastern Desert, were worked continuously for centuries. Imagine generations of miners descending into the same dusty shafts, chasing the same shimmering promise. Few would return rich. Most would return broken if they returned at all. Today, when tourists admire the golden mask of Tutankhamun or the gilded sarcophagi of later pharaohs, they see only splendour. They do not see the long caravans that carried that wealth from the southern frontier. They do not see the slaves, the blood, the heat. They do not see Nubia, but Nubia is there. It always was. Beneath every golden artifact lies a buried truth that Egypt's greatness, for all its marvels, was built in part on greed. And at the heart of that hunger was a kingdom to the south, rich not only in gold, but in culture, memory, and endurance. In the end, gold is both a gift and a curse. It shines with beauty, but blinds with desire. For Egypt, it offered immortality, glory that would echo through millennia. But for Nubia, it brought chains, conquest, and centuries of silence. Even now, the gold remains, but so does the silence. And if you listen closely, past the echo of empire and the roar of propaganda, you can still hear the whisper of the hills, the land of gold, the price of power, and a kingdom that refused to be forgotten. The day the pharaohs bowed to the south was not marked by fanfare in Egyptian records. No hymns announced it, no triumphal steles boasted of it from Memphis to Thebes. But history turned all the same. In a stunning reversal, the land once plundered for gold and tribute rose up and took the throne. The Kushites, children of Nubia, descendants of forgotten kings and desert warriors, marched north, not as raiders, but as rulers. It began not with war, but with weakness. Egypt, long fractured by internal strife and foreign meddling, had splintered. Petty kings ruled small regions. Temples hoarded power, while the royal image dimmed. The divine authority of pharaohs had become little more than a ceremonial mask, worn by men without vision. Into this vacuum came strength not from the Delta or the Sinai, but from Napata, deep in Nubian soil. There, the kings of Kush had been building, not just armies, but legacy. Their temples rivaled Egyptian sanctuaries. Their gods mirrored those of the north, yet bore the unmistakable stamp of southern tradition. They were no longer imitators, they were inheritors. The man who would change everything was named Piye. A devout and disciplined ruler, Piye was not content to merely guard Nubia's borders. He saw Egypt's decay and considered it a danger to Ma'at, the divine balance that held the universe together. If chaos reigned in Egypt, the whole Nile world was at risk. And so, in the name of order, Piye launched his campaign. But this was no simple conquest. Piye approached the north not only as a general, but as a believer. He visited temples. He made offerings. He honoured Egyptian gods with genuine reverence. His own writings, inscribed on a monumental stela, describe his journey like a pilgrimage. He does not revel in slaughter, though there was blood. He does not boast of cruelty, though there was resistance. Instead, he presents himself as a restorer of harmony, a southern king cleansing the northern crown. One by one, The divided lords of Egypt submitted. Some welcomed Piye, others fought and fell. When he reached Memphis, he besieged it with precision and power. The city yielded. The north, for the first time in history, belonged to a Kushite, but Piye did not stay. In a move that confounded later historians, he returned to Napata after his victory. He did not drape himself in Egyptian splendor. He did not claim Thebes as his capital. He ruled from the south, as if to remind the Nile where its strength truly flowed from. Piye's descendants continued what he began. His brother, Shabaka, formally established the 25th dynasty. His nephew, Taharqa, would become one of the most powerful rulers of the era, known for massive building projects and military campaigns that reached into the Near East. Under these Kushite pharaohs, Egypt experienced a revival, a last golden age before the twilight of native rule. Temples were restored, statues were carved in the old styles, yet with subtle differences. The faces of the Kushite pharaohs were distinct, broad-nosed, strong-jawed, unmistakably Nubian. They wore the double crown, but also the ram-headed god Amun's regalia, linking themselves to both Egyptian tradition and their own southern roots. Their queens, the Kandakes, wielded real power warrior priestesses and regents who stood beside kings, not behind them. To Egypt's elites, this was both a shock and a reminder. The South, long treated as a cultural echo or a resource colony, had never been lesser. It had always been watching, remembering, preserving, and when Egypt faltered, it was the South that upheld the flame. But not everyone welcomed this inversion. In the northeast, the Assyrian Empire stirred, powerful, brutal, and ambitious. The Assyrians viewed Egypt's revival with suspicion. Their control over the Levant, stretching from Babylon to the Mediterranean, was now threatened by Kushite influence. They moved swiftly. By the time of Taharqa, the Assyrians were at the gates. First came skirmishes, then full-blown invasions. Egyptian cities fell. One after another, Taharqa fought valiantly, but the tide was against him. The Assyrians were relentless. Their siege engines shattered walls. Their armies overwhelmed defenders. Eventually, Memphis was captured. Taharqa retreated south. His successor, Tanu Tamani, tried to reclaim the north, but the dream of united rule was fading. By the end of the century, the Kushite pharaohs had been pushed back into Nubia. The 25th dynasty was over. Egypt would soon fall under foreign dominion, first Assyrian, then Persian, then Greek, and finally Roman. But for a brief, extraordinary moment, the south had ruled the north, the river had reversed, and history had blinked. The legacy of the Kushite dynasty did not end with retreat. Their impact rippled across centuries. They proved that the Nile was not the possession of one people or one culture. It was a shared artery of civilization. Nubia had always been more than a margin. It was a source. Today, statues of Piye and Taharqa stand in museums around the world. Some are labelled merely as Egyptian pharaohs, erasing their roots. Others bear fuller names: Kushite king, son of Napata, lord of the south. But none of them should be forgotten, because in their rise and reign, we glimpse a deeper truth, that history is not a straight line. It bends, it shifts, and sometimes the shadow becomes the crown. This was no anomaly. It was a reckoning. For centuries, Egypt had looked downriver for labour, for wealth, for tribute. But it had also exported its gods, its architecture, its language, and in doing so, it planted seeds. When those seeds bore fruit, they looked back not with envy, but with purpose, not to destroy Egypt, but to remind it who stood with it in the beginning. The Kushite pharaohs did not steal the throne. They reclaimed it. They reminded the world that before pyramids rose and temples gleamed, kings once ruled from the sands of Nubia, and when Egypt forgot its past, the past came riding north to wear the crown once more. The black pharaohs did not emerge from the shadows. They rose from the sun-soaked sands of the south, where the Nile carved its path through stone and memory. In a world where Egypt's golden age had begun to fade, these kings from Kush brought not ruin, but revival. Their skin was dark as the fertile soil along the riverbanks. Their lineage traced not to the halls of Thebes or the courts of Memphis, but to the temples of Napata and the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal. And when they crossed into Egypt, they did not come as conquerors alone, they came as keepers of the flame. Piye was the first, not the first king of Kush, but the first to wear Egypt's double crown in generations with both conviction and legitimacy. His campaign was swift, but not savage. As he moved through a fractured Egypt, torn by petty kings and rival warlords, he did not simply defeat them, he outclassed them. In his famous stela, carved in stone and left for posterity, Piye declared not just military victory, but spiritual supremacy. He offered sacrifices at temples the Egyptian rulers had neglected. He wept at the feet of neglected gods. He claimed the favour of Amun, both Theban and Nubian, and declared that he had not taken Egypt by force, but by divine right. And yet, once victorious, Piye did something few conquerors would dare. He turned around. He returned to Nubia, to Napata, leaving Egypt in the hands of governors and loyal priests. He had proven his point. Egypt did not need a new tyrant. It needed a steward of memory. And Piye, the Black Pharaoh, was content to reign from the south. But the legacy did not end with him. His dynasty, the 25th dynasty, would give Egypt some of its most resilient and ambitious rulers. Among them stood Taharqa, perhaps the most legendary of them all. A warrior, a builder, a dreamer. Taharqa's reign was not defined by plunder, but by preservation. He restored temples that had crumbled. He commissioned colossi that stood beside the great statues of Ramses. He looked not only to the south or to Egypt, but to the world beyond. His armies clashed with the Assyrians, then the most brutal force in the ancient world. His campaigns stretched to the Levant. His name was feared in Nineveh and honoured in Thebes. But beyond war, Taharqa understood image. He built his legacy in stone, in the temples of Karnak and Kawa. His inscriptions speak of cosmic balance and divine favour. His statues, carved with round Nubian features and crowned with the cobra of Egypt, were a political statement. This was not a usurper. This was a pharaoh, as legitimate as any born in the Delta. And then there was Shabaka, who came after Piye and before Taharqa. Shabaka ordered the preservation of sacred texts. One of the most important religious documents in Egyptian history, the Memphite theology, was inscribed on stone during his reign. He respected the ancient ways, not as archaeology, but as living truth. Under his rule, the boundaries between Nubia and Egypt blurred further, not by force, but by reverence. To call them black pharaohs is not merely a reference to skin. It is a recognition of origin. These were men who came from the south, where Egypt had once looked for gold and soldiers and labour. Now Egypt looked for leadership. And the south answered. Their reign did not mark a foreign occupation. It marked a renaissance, an echo of the earliest Nile kingdoms, when Tarseti and other southern polities had stood proudly as equals to Egypt. But history, as always, is not kind to victors who rewrite the script. After the Kushite dynasty fell, driven back by the iron grip of the Assyrians, their memory was altered. Later Egyptian kings, especially those of the succeeding 26th dynasty, sought to erase them. Temples built by Kushites were overwritten. Statues were recarved. Names were scraped from walls. The story was rewritten to make it seem as though Egypt had simply reclaimed what was always hers. The Black Pharaohs were treated as a historical detour, an interruption, not a continuation. And yet, the evidence persisted. In Napata and further south in Meroe, the Kushite tradition evolved. Long after they left Egypt, they ruled their own lands with pride. Their queens, the Kandakes, led armies and struck treaties. Their pyramids dotted the Nubian landscape, smaller and steeper than those of Giza, but no less regal. Their writing system shifted, their gods merged and diverged, but the thread of memory remained unbroken. Modern scholars have reawakened that thread. The incense burner from Kustul, the royal tombs at El Kuru and Nuri, the stela of Piye, the temples of Tahaka. These are not scattered relics. They are chapters in a forgotten chronicle, a record of an empire that remembered Egypt, even when Egypt forgot itself. Today, when we speak of Egypt's greatness, we cannot stop at the Nile Delta. We must follow the river upstream, through cataracts and sandstone cliffs, to the lands where the Black Pharaohs were born. Their rule was not an accident of war. It was a moment of balance restored. Egypt, in her time of need, turned to the south, and the south answered with dignity, with majesty, and with vision. The story of the Black Pharaohs is not simply African history or Egyptian history. It is world history. It challenges assumptions about where greatness begins. It reminds us that civilization does not belong to geography. It belongs to memory. And memory, like the Nile, flows both north and south. They were not invaders. They were inheritors. They did not plunder. They rebuilt. They did not erase. They remembered. And in remembering, they carved their names into stone not as shadows of Egypt's past, but as beacons of a future that still had room for the old gods, the sacred truths, and the throne that sat between heaven and earth. Meroe rose, where the sands whispered a different kind of story. It was not a city born to mimic Egypt, though pyramids pierced its skies and temples bore the names of familiar gods. Meroe was its own heartbeat, its own fire, and its own rhythm. It stood proudly on the eastern bank of the Nile, near the Sixth Cataract, far south of Thebes and Memphis. And though Egypt once ruled the world's imagination, Meroe ruled something else entirely, an identity that was neither shadow nor echo. Here, the Nile curled with thick reeds and summer storms. Iron hissed in furnaces as workers in soot-blackened robes stoked fires, not for ritual, but for war and trade. Blacksmiths were honoured. Tools were sharp. Spears were stronger. Meroe's lifeblood was not limestone, but iron ore, pulled from the earth and forged into the weapons and ploughs of a kingdom that had long since outgrown its dependency on northern culture. The pyramids of Meroe were not monuments to imitation. They were declarations. Dozens of them rose in clusters across the desert horizon, small and steep, with sharp angles and narrow bases. They were not the sprawling perfection of Giza. They were defiant. Their proportions echoed older Nubian burial customs. But each carried the authority of a royal tomb. Within them lay kings and queens, especially queens, whose power in Meroe was unlike anything seen in Egypt. The Kandakes, or Candaces, ruled in their own right, leading armies, commissioning monuments, and appearing in art not as consorts, but as sovereigns. Meroe's writing system was unique. Around the 3rd century BCE, the scribes of Meroe abandoned Egyptian hieroglyphs in favour of their own script. It was called Meroitic, and though it has yet to be fully deciphered, its presence tells us something crucial. The Kushites were no longer writing for Egypt. They were writing for themselves. They developed both a cursive and a hieroglyphic version, using ink and brush as often as chisel and stone. Their language, though still mysterious, marked a turning point, the beginning of a self-contained civilization with its own literary voice. The culture of Meroe danced between the old and the new. Temples to Amun still stood, and the lion-headed goddess Apidimak, fierce and native to Nubia, emerged with new prominence. In carved reliefs, she is seen blessing kings with power, standing beside queens, guiding chariots, and wielding scimitars. Apidimak was not borrowed. She was born of Meroe, a deity of war, protection, and statecraft. She embodied the confidence of a people who no longer needed Egyptian validation. Commerce flowed through the city's veins. Meroe controlled caravan routes stretching deep into Africa. Exotic goods arrived from the interior: leopard skins, ivory tusks, incense resins, and enslaved captives. These were traded northward in exchange for silver, luxury goods, and glasswork. It was a crossroads of worlds, a trading empire stitched together by sand and ambition. Greek and Roman travellers wrote of Meroe, not always understanding it, but always noting its power. They called it Ethiopia, not as we understand the term today, but as a label for the mysterious lands beyond Egypt, where black kings ruled and pyramids multiplied. Meroe was not built in a day. It was the culmination of centuries of Kushite evolution. After the fall of Napata to invading Egyptian forces and later pressure from Assyria, the Kushites moved south, reorganized, and reimagined themselves. The move was not retreat, it was reinvention, and with time, Meroe surpassed its predecessors. The city flourished for nearly 1,000 years, from around the 3rd century BCE to the 4th century CE. Few empires in antiquity matched that longevity, even as Rome burned and empires shattered across the Mediterranean. Meroe endured, but no kingdom is forever. In time, Meroe began to falter. Overgrazing may have stripped the surrounding lands of their fertility. The iron furnaces, once a symbol of power, may have also accelerated ecological decline. Political unity weakened, trade routes shifted, and new enemies rose. The kingdom of Aksum, further to the southeast, began to expand, and with that expansion came the final blow. Around the 4th century CE, Aksumite forces invaded. They conquered Meroe, and the city faded into legend. Its pyramids, buried by sand and neglect, became curiosities for later explorers. Many were looted, some were dynamited, but the stones remained, and so did the story, though only whispered. For centuries, the world forgot Meroe. Egypt, with its Rosetta Stone and colossi, dazzled scholars and treasure hunters alike. Nubia was seen as peripheral, exotic at best. But the narrative has begun to shift. Archaeologists now recognize that Meroe was not a poor cousin to Egypt. It was a peer, a civilization with its own script, its own gods, its own royalty, and its own artistic vision. Today, visitors to Sudan walk among the ruins with reverence. The pyramids are smaller, yes, but no less sacred. Their sharp silhouettes against the desert sun remind us that civilization takes many forms. The ancients of Meroe did not build to match someone else's greatness. They built to mark their own. In the end, Meroe was not just a continuation of Kush. It was a renaissance. It was a declaration that African power, beauty, and sovereignty could flourish on their own terms. It was not Egypt's heir. It was its mirror, and perhaps its better, in ways history has only begun to admit. The sands do not forget. They bury, they preserve, and when the time is right, they reveal. Meroe waited patiently beneath those sands, waiting for the world to remember. And now, stone by stone, letter by letter, We are learning to listen. They called them Kandakes, and in the heat and iron of Nubia, they ruled like fire wrapped in flesh, not queens beside kings, not daughters promised in marriage, but sovereigns, supreme. When history tells the story of ancient power, it too often forgets them. But in the shadow of Meroe's pyramids and on the battlefields of the Nile's southern reaches, the Kandakes carved their legacy into stone and steel. The word Kandake, sometimes rendered Candace by Greco-Roman writers, was more than a name. It was a title, passed down from queen to queen. And with that title came command over armies, over trade, over gods, long before the concept of female leadership became fashionable in distant empires. The Nubians had already embraced it. Here, power had no gender. It had presence. One of the most legendary Kandakes emerged in the 1st century BCE. Her name was Amanirenas. Her image, though weathered by time, survives in inscriptions and sculpture. A regal woman with tightly braided hair, often shown, wielding a weapon or standing beside prisoners of war. Her reign began not in peace, but in defiance. Rome, fresh from absorbing Egypt into its empire after the death of Cleopatra, turned its gaze southward. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, sent legions to solidify his hold on the Nile, but the Nubians did not bow. In fact, they struck first. Around the year 25 BCE, Amanirenas led a military campaign into Roman-controlled Egypt. She took several cities, including Syene and Elephantine, and returned south with spoils and statues, one of which was a likeness of Augustus himself. That statue's head, ripped from its shoulders, was buried beneath a temple staircase in Meroe. A clear message. Every worshipper who entered the sanctuary stepped on the face of the Roman emperor. Rome retaliated. As empires do, the general Petronius marched deep into Nubia, retaking territory and pushing south toward Napata. But he never conquered Meroe. He stopped short, not out of mercy, but from necessity. The Nubians had withdrawn strategically, burning fields and denying supplies. Roman forces, unused to the terrain and cut off from resources, could go no farther. A diplomatic stalemate followed. What came next was remarkable. Amanirenas, blind in one eye and hardened by war, sent envoys to Augustus himself. They negotiated not from weakness, but from strength. The resulting treaty was favourable to the Nubians. Rome pulled back its borders, agreed to peace, and exempted Nubia from tribute. In a world where even mighty nations bowed before Roman authority, the Kandake secured sovereignty without compromise. Amanirenas was not the only warrior queen. Others followed Amanishakheto, known for her opulent jewellery and architectural commissions, and Amanitore, who ruled jointly with her son and launched a wave of temple restoration that rivaled pharaonic grandeur. These queens were not figureheads. They were builders, commanders, high priestesses. Some led armies in person. Others raised monuments in their own name. Their likenesses appear on temple walls and pyramid entrances, not as passive beauties, but as mighty figures adorned with regalia, sceptres, and lion-headed deities. This was a society where women could ascend to the throne and wield divine authority. Some inscriptions even place them as the intermediaries between gods and people, a role traditionally held by kings in other cultures. It is possible, even likely, that matrilineal succession was the norm, where power passed through the female line, securing dynastic continuity, not through princes, but through princesses and their chosen heirs. Meroe's embrace of female leadership was not a cultural accident. It echoed ancient Nubian traditions, where goddesses like Isis and Apedimak were worshipped with reverence and balance. It was also a political strength. In times of invasion, the Kandakes did not vanish into the palace walls. They mounted horses, rallied troops, and sent messages to foreign kings, written not in ink, but in blood and resilience. The Romans, Greeks, and even Egyptians, though often dismissive of foreign powers, could not ignore the Kandakes. Classical writers noted their defiance, even if they misunderstood it. They described Nubia as a land ruled by warrior women. Some cast it as exotic. Others called it dangerous. Few recognized it as a functional system of governance, where the line between king and queen was not so much blurred as completely irrelevant. In art, the Kandakes appear alongside gods, not beneath them. In architecture, they commanded the construction of temples, reservoirs, and palaces. In economics, they managed trade networks that stretched into sub-Saharan Africa and across the Red Sea. Their jewellery, found in tombs and museums, was exquisite gold cuffs, intricate rings, and massive pendants, many inscribed with their names and titles. Each piece whispered of wealth, of power, of a sovereignty earned rather than inherited. The power of the Kandakes challenges assumptions. It forces us to rethink the narrative that greatness in antiquity was only forged by male hands. In Meroe, the crown sat as easily on the brow of a queen as it did on a king. And sometimes it sat better. Their legacy, long buried, is now slowly resurfacing. Archaeologists in Sudan continue to uncover inscriptions and ruins that speak of these rulers. And with every dig, every glyph, the story expands. The story of queens who did not wait for permission, who made war when war was needed, who protected their people with fire, governed with iron, and wrote their names into the very bones of the desert. The Kandakes remind us that history is not just what was written, it is also what was buried, silenced, or misinterpreted. And in the quiet chambers of forgotten pyramids, their names still resound. Power wears many faces. Sometimes it is masked in gold, sometimes in silence, but sometimes it wears a crown, rides into battle, and says nothing at all because it does not need to explain itself. The Kandakes did not ask to be remembered. They made it impossible to forget. For decades, the narrative of ancient history was told in half-light, filtered through colonial eyes, buried beneath assumptions, and framed by the echo chamber of conquest. But now, with science as our compass and ancestry as our trail, the truth begins to surface. The bloodlines of Nubia, long dismissed or misclassified, are finally speaking for themselves. And what they say is powerful. They say the story did not start in the north. It started deep in Africa. For centuries, outdated racial theories attempted to erase the African identity of the Nubians. Early Western scholars, influenced by the racial politics of the 19th and early 20th centuries, insisted that any civilization capable of building pyramids, commanding empires, and challenging Egypt must have had external influence. Some posited that Nubia was a satellite of Egypt. Others went further, absurdly suggesting that Mediterranean or even Semitic peoples had founded the Nubian kingdoms. Their logic was not scientific, it was supremacist. But modern genetics cares nothing for ideology. It speaks in sequences and strands, not in prejudice. And the evidence from ancient DNA, as well as linguistic and cultural studies, has started to rewrite the record. Ancient Nubians, particularly those from Kerma, Napata, and Meroe, display clear genetic affinities with sub-Saharan African populations. This connection is not a footnote. It is the spine of the story. A breakthrough came when researchers extracted DNA from remains found in the region of Upper Nubia. These genetic signatures showed deep links to populations in today's Sudan, Ethiopia, Chad, and even as far west as Nigeria, traits common to Nilotic and Cushitic peoples: dark skin, tightly coiled hair, and facial features associated with sub-Saharan populations were not anomalies in Nubia, they were the norm. Nubia was not a pale shadow of Egypt, it was a black African civilization with its own deep roots. Linguistics backs this up. The languages spoken in ancient Nubia were part of the Eastern Sudanic branch of the Nilo-Saharan family languages indigenous to the African interior. These tongues have nothing in common with Indo-European languages or the Semitic tongues of the Levant. Instead, they align with languages still spoken today in South Sudan, Eritrea, and parts of Ethiopia. This linguistic fingerprint is yet another thread in the tapestry of African continuity. Anthropology adds further depth. The burial practices, architectural forms, and artistic traditions found in Nubian sites bear striking resemblance to those in sub-Saharan Africa, from cattle cults in the Green Sahara to the sacred lakes and fire rituals of the later Meroitic period. The Nubians carried spiritual systems that long predated and possibly influenced Egyptian cosmology. The depiction of rulers with African features was not an artistic choice. It was a reflection of reality. Consider the crowns worn by the Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty. These were not imitations of northern styles. They were distinctly African, adorned with double cobras and sun discs rooted in southern iconography. Temples in Meroe show gods and rulers with features matching the local population. These were not appropriations. They were declarations of identity. Some of the earliest known uses of ironworking in Africa came from Meroe. This was not a borrowed craft. It was homegrown, adapted to local geology, and refined into an industry that turned Meroe into a powerhouse. Similarly, the written script used in later Kushite periods, the Meroitic script, remains one of the great undeciphered alphabets. What we do know is that it was wholly independent from Egyptian hieroglyphs, a system crafted not in imitation, but in innovation. So why were these truths obscured for so long? Part of the answer lies in who was telling the story. For generations, archaeology was dominated by European institutions that arrived not to learn, but to label. Their maps placed Egypt at the center of civilization and positioned sub-Saharan Africa as peripheral. Anything that contradicted that hierarchy was either downplayed or explained away. They chiseled doubt into every Nubian temple and buried questions beneath every pyramid not built in Giza. But the tide is turning. African scholars, Sudanese archaeologists, and interdisciplinary researchers are reclaiming the narrative. Armed with satellite imaging, radiocarbon dating, and genome sequencing, they are proving what oral histories and cultural memory have long insisted: that Nubia was a black African empire, that its people were part of a vast cultural network stretching across the Sahel, the Horn, and the Great Lakes, that Egypt, for all its grandeur, was not the mother but the sister. This truth challenges the very architecture of how ancient history has been taught. It demands that we stop treating Africa as a continent waiting to be discovered and start recognizing it as a crucible of civilization. From Nabta Playa to Tarseti, from Kerma to Napata to Meroe, the Nile did not flow in one direction. Influence, power, and innovation surged upstream as well. Modern DNA studies have also shattered the myth that African civilizations were isolated. There is growing evidence of genetic admixture across North Africa and the Levant. Yes, but the flow was complex and multidirectional. Africans travelled, traded, migrated, and mingled. They were not static tribes behind deserts. They were engineers of empire and architects of meaning. and their legacy echoes in the genes of millions living today across the African continent. In the end, DNA does not care about borders drawn by colonial hands. It follows the river of ancestry, winding through time and space. It connects the Nubian kings buried in black granite tombs with cattle herders in the Sahel. It links the ironworkers of Merowe with farmers in the Great Rift Valley. It binds the past to the present, not in theory, but in blood. The myth of a lost black civilization is only a myth because someone worked hard to lose it. But it was never gone. It was written into genomes, etched into bone, sung into lullabies, and hidden in plain sight. And now, as science and memory meet, it rises again. This is what the DNA says. It says Nubia was African, gloriously, unapologetically, and powerfully so. For far too long, Tar Seti stood in the shadows of history, its legacy half-remembered, misrepresented, or erased altogether. A kingdom that may have birthed the very concept of kingship in the Nile Valley was reduced to a footnote beneath Egypt's towering pyramids. But now, the winds are shifting. Across the world, from dusty museum basements to digital databases, scholars, activists, and descendants alike are rediscovering the legacy of Tar Seti, and with it, they are challenging everything we thought we knew about where civilization began. It begins with names. Tar Seti, the land of the bow, one of the oldest names found in Egyptian texts, always associated with the south, with Nubia, with archers so skilled they were feared by pharaohs. For centuries, historians viewed this land as peripheral, at best, a rival, at worst, a barbaric backwater. But now, as archaeologists re-examine the material evidence and recontextualize ancient texts, a different story is emerging. Tar Seti may not have been Egypt's rival. It may have been its teacher. Excavations at sites like Kustul, Kerma, and Sai Island are no longer seen as mere appendices to the Egyptian story. They are being reframed as centers of innovation and identity in their own right. The incense burner discovered at Kustul, with its detailed depiction of a crowned king in pharaonic regalia, was once a curiosity. Today, it is a cornerstone of a new hypothesis that the earliest expressions of kingship, ceremonial processions, and divine rulership may have originated not in Lower Egypt, but in the far south, in Nubia. Institutions once slow to change are now beginning to listen. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, each holds collections of Nubian artifacts once treated as minor exhibits. But recent campaigns, led in part by Sudanese scholars and diasporic African voices, have pushed for reattribution, repatriation, and most importantly, re-examination. In conference halls and university seminars, the question is being asked more boldly: what if Egypt's greatness grew from southern soil? One of the driving forces behind this renewed interest is the recognition of bias in earlier scholarship. The archaeologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries were often colonial agents, working under imperial ideologies. Their classifications, measurements, and interpretations were not neutral. They brought their prejudices into the field, and those biases seeped into textbooks, documentaries, and museum labels. Civilizations with black African origins were systematically diminished, their achievements attributed to outside influence or mere imitation. But today's generation of researchers is different. They are interdisciplinary. They are global. They are collaborative. And many of them are African. Sudanese archaeologists, in particular, are taking the lead in excavating their own history, reclaiming the narrative not as subjects of study, but as storytellers. They walk the same riverbanks, speak the same languages, and remember the same oral histories passed down from ancestors who always knew that greatness once lived here. In Khartoum, the National Museum of Sudan has become a beacon for this revival. Its halls now echo with the footfalls of students, scholars, and families rediscovering the legacy of Tarseti, Kerma, and Merowe. New exhibitions highlight the advanced metallurgy, vast trade networks, and spiritual systems of ancient Nubia. School children learn not only of pharaohs, but of Kandakes and Kushite kings. And the question posed to every visitor is simple yet revolutionary. What if the story began here? Digital platforms are amplifying this shift. Online archives, virtual reconstructions, and open access journals are breaking down barriers that once kept Nubian history locked in ivory towers. Suddenly, a student in Lagos, a teacher in Chicago, or a filmmaker in Nairobi can explore the intricacies of the Kustul incense burner, the layout of Kerma's Defufa temples, or the iconography carved into Meroitic pyramids. And what they see is not a supporting role in someone else's epic. They see a civilization in full. Language is also being reclaimed. Where once Nubia was spoken of as a periphery, now scholars talk of the Nubian Nile corridor, a central artery of cultural development. Where once the term Black Pharaohs was used as an exotic label, it is now being challenged as limiting and othering. These rulers were not Black Pharaohs. They were pharaohs. Full stop. And the civilization they governed was not a shadow. It was a light in its own right. There is also a growing call for restitution, not just of artifacts, but of dignity. Communities in Sudan are asking for the return of stolen statues, jewelry, and sacred objects, but they are also asking for the return of visibility, the right to see themselves reflected in the global narrative of civilization. Because for every crown that sits behind glass in a European museum, there is a child in Nubia who deserves to know that it once crowned a king from their own land. Universities, too, are playing a vital role. New academic programs in African archaeology, Nubian studies, and decolonial history are flourishing. Scholars are being trained not just to excavate ruins, but to rebuild memory. They are learning ancient scripts, tracing trade routes, and translating oral traditions that were once dismissed as myth, and in doing so, they are piecing together a story that was never truly lost, only buried. Rediscovering Tarseti is more than an academic exercise. It is an act of justice. It is a restoration of balance in the telling of human history. Because when we center Egypt and erase Nubia, we do not just misplace geography, we misplace genius, courage, and truth. The story of Tarseti is the story of people who carved monuments in stone, who mapped the stars before Stonehenge, who crowned kings before Narmer, and that story belongs to all of us. This reawakening is not about tearing down the legacy of Egypt. It is about expanding the canvas to include all the voices, all the roots, all the tributaries that fed the Nile's brilliance. Tarseti is no longer forgotten. It is being remembered in classrooms, in dig sites, in poems, and in hearts. And with every discovery, every artifact re-examined, every map redrawn, the empire time forgot steps forward once more, proud, black, and alive. Before the pyramids pierced the sky, before the Nile's banks echoed with hymns to Osiris and Ra, before the name of Egypt became legend, there was memory, not written in papyrus scrolls or carved into temple walls, but etched deeper in the stones buried beneath the sands, in the bones of forgotten kings, in the echoes of cattle herders watching constellations over the desert horizon. In the beginning, before dynasties and divine pharaohs, there was a people whose legacy has been eroded, misnamed, and overshadowed, but their fingerprints are everywhere. Egypt did not rise in a vacuum. It rose on a foundation already laid. Tarseti, the land of the bow. A kingdom that breathed long before the name Egypt had meaning. Its kings rode the river south to north, bearing crowns and standards, not as invaders, but as ancestors. Its symbols falcons in flight, sacred boats, sun discs, and serpents later adorned Egyptian temples. But they did not begin there. They came from a deeper source, older than the Nile's northern delta, rooted in lands we once called Nubia, and now remember as the very soil of civilization. The first crowns may have rested not on Nama's brow, but on a ruler from Kustal. The earliest palaces may not have stood at Memphis or Thebes, but amid the fortress cities of Kerma, or even earlier, in the stone circles of Nabta Playa, where stars guided ritual before calendars had names. The architecture of spirit, the thrones of meaning, the myths of divine kingship. These were not sudden Egyptian inventions. They were inheritances, memory passed down like water flowing from south to north, from highlands to floodplains, from forgotten kingdoms to immortal empires. This truth does not diminish Egypt. It deepens it. For every monument has a blueprint, every myth a whisper that came before. The Sphinx may gaze east into eternity, but the gaze of Tarseti is fixed within Egypt itself, a reflection too long ignored. The hieroglyphs speak of conquest and order, but below them lie the older patterns, the roots of ritual, the bones of beliefs that predate dynastic time. In this story, history and memory collide. History, the version told by victors, etched into stone with a chisel and hammer, always looks forward, always proclaims firsts and founders. But memory does not care for conquest. It lingers in the shade. It lives in the silence between records, in the pottery shards misfiled, in the statues labelled foreign, in the old names that were scratched out, only to return centuries later with new pronunciations and forgotten meanings. The people of Tarseti were not erased completely. They were remembered as foes, rivals, and barbarians in Egyptian texts. But even those insults carried a strange reverence. To be feared by Egypt was to be formidable. To be called wild was, perhaps, to be too ancient, too independent, too unwilling to kneel. The land of the bow was not simply conquered. It was assimilated, its gods blended with Egyptian ones, its symbols adopted, its memory distorted but never entirely extinguished. Even when Egypt grew mighty and pushed southward in campaigns of gold and glory, it could not sever its tether to the past. The land it subdued was also the land that had birthed its deepest foundations. In a twist only time can reveal, the cycle turned. Kushite kings rose centuries later, swept north, and sat upon the pharaoh's throne. The children of Tarseti returned not as rebels, but as restorers. They rebuilt temples, revived traditions, and reminded the world that memory runs deeper than empire. Today, as dust is brushed off stone and DNA is read like scripture, the past stirs again. The pyramids of Meroe, the crowns of Kustal, the constellations of Nabta Playa, they are all speaking. They do not demand to replace Egypt's glory. They ask only to be remembered as part of its origin. They call to us across millennia, whispering, before the pyramids, we stood here. Before Egypt, we watched the stars. Before kings ruled with crooks and flails, we raised cattle, mapped the skies, honoured our dead with ceremony, and dreamed the first dreams of order rising from chaos. In that reflection, we see ourselves. A world obsessed with beginnings has often missed the truest ones. Civilizations do not spring up from sand in an instant. They unfold like the Nile itself, starting far upstream, fed by unseen tributaries, deep currents that shape the surface long before the flood is visible. Tarseti was one such current, invisible to the early eyes of history, but powerful enough to shape the future. And so we return to memory, not as nostalgia, but as recognition. The people of Taseti are not lost. Their story lives in stone circles and incense burners, in ancient crowns and buried cities. Their blood still flows through the veins of the Nile Valley. Their spirit lingers in the winds of the eastern desert. And their legacy, long denied, now rises once more, not as a whisper, but as a declaration. Before Egypt, there was memory, and in that memory lives the first flicker of civilization's flame. It never truly went out. It waited, buried in sand and silence, for the day we would remember who came first and what they left behind.